Okay. All right, folks. We are here. Welcome to the 2022 Migrant Trail Encuentro. And I'm going to turn it over to Kat Rodriguez. Kat.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kat Rodriguez, and on behalf of the organizing committee of the Migrant Trail, I want to welcome you to the Migrant Trail Border Encuentro. This is our 19th year of gathering together to bear witness to the deaths of women, men, and children on the U.S.-Mexico border. In preparation for this welcome today, I looked back at our registration list over the last 19 years. I tallied all the folks who have registered for the Migrant Trail. Since 2004, we've had 1,386 participants join us on the walk. For the years that we were in person, these numbers don't reflect the individuals that brought us food, water, supplies, and supported us in so many ways that are vital to us when you have a group of people out in the Arizona desert. I'm honored to say that I was part of the group that walked that first year. It was uncharted territory for us, and in many ways we had to figure things out in real time and on the fly. That first year, many of us made the journey because we've personally known people who've lost their lives on the border. We have friends who've lost loved ones to this desert. And that first year, we wanted to be present in that space, not to simulate the experience of the migrant, which is impossible for us to do, but to offer our presence, our hearts, and our witness. When we came back that first year, we were greeted by more than 100 people at Kennedy Park, and we were welcomed with open arms, food, drink, and music. I often tell people that I consider the receiving ceremony at the end of the Migrant Trail to be a vision of how we wish our migrant sisters and brothers were welcomed in this country. Almost immediately after the walk, we were asked the question, will you walk again next year? And a group of us sat down that following January and we discussed the possibility of another migrant trail. We took this question very seriously. Apart from being a lot of work, we considered the purpose of the walk. In the end, we came to the consensus that we would walk again that year, but only if we committed to the migrant trail until the deaths ended on the border. We felt confident in those early years that there was some magic number we could reach, some critical mass that we could attain that would make the deaths stop. I can tell you that 19 years ago, I never dreamed that I'd still be doing the Migrant Trail. And it hurts my heart to admit that I no longer believe in magic numbers. It very much feels as though we've lost ground on bringing awareness about the need to challenge militarization policies and to stop the deaths on the border. And yet I have hope. There's always hope and a chance for change. So today is about hope. It's about being able to speak our truth about the border. It's about bearing witness not just to the deaths on the border, but to the violence that has been normalized in border communities. And it's about creating a space to build a world we believe in. Otro mundo es posible. Another world is possible. On behalf of my fellow Migrant Trail Organizing Committee members, Tom Cowell, Bob Norris, Pastor Eric Letterman, Jamie Wilson, Brother David Buer, Christy Brooks, Margot Cowan, and Lupe Castillo, I thank you for joining us today. And I'd like to close with reading our vision statement. The precarious reality of our borderlands calls us to walk. We are a spiritually diverse, multicultural group who walk together on a journey of peace to remember people, friends, and family who have died, others who have crossed, and people who continue to come. We bear witness to the tragedy of death and of the inhumanity in our midst. Lastly, we make this sacred journey as a community in defiance of the borders that attempt to divide us, committed to working together for the human dignity of all peoples. Thank you.
Good morning, Migrant Trail participants and supporters. My name is Natividad Cano. I'm originally from Sasaves, Sonora, and now living in Tucson, Arizona. And right now I am standing in the ancestral lands of the Tohono O'odham Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge the ancestors for preserving this land since time immemorial. also the members of the Pascuayaqui tribe who have stewarded these lands for our benefit. And I hope that you have a wonderful day with the Migrant Trail today, and may Creator bless all of you.
Many people know about St. Francis of Assisi, and he's probably best known by the peace prayer of St. Francis. Lord, make me a channel of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. But he actually did not write that peace prayer. People who were inspired by him wrote it. But what he did actually write himself is called the Canticle of the Sun. And that is what I'd like to read to you as we call a blessing upon our day together today. Most high, all powerful, all good Lord, all praise is yours, all glory, all honor, and all blessing. To you alone, Most High, do they belong. No mortal lips are worthy to pronounce your name. All praise be yours, my Lord, through all that you have made, and first, my Lord, brother's Son, who brings the day and light you give to us through him. How beautiful is he, how radiant in all his splendor. Of you, Most High, he bears the likeness. All praise be yours, my Lord, through sister moon and stars. In the heavens you have made them bright and precious and fair. All praise be yours, my Lord, through brothers wind and air, and fair and stormy, all the weather's moods, by which you cherish all that you have made. All praise be yours, my Lord, through sister water, so useful, lowly, precious, and pure. All praise be yours, my Lord, through brother fire, through whom you brighten up the night. How beautiful is he, how joyful, full of power and strength. All praise be yours, my Lord, through sister earth, our mother, who feeds us in her sovereignty and produces various fruits and with colored flowers and herbs. All praise be yours, my Lord, through those who grant pardon for love of you, through those who endure sickness and trial. Happy those who endure in peace. By you, Most High, they will be crowned. All praise be yours, my Lord, through sister death, from whose embrace no mortals can escape. Woe to those who die in mortal sin. Happy those she finds doing your will. The second death can do no harm to them. Praise and bless my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility.
Eric, you're muted.
That's not helpful. I'm Eric Letterman, pastor at University Presbyterian Church. So glad to have you all here. I'm going to be helping us kind of in the background, running some of the tech and the back part of Zoom. And so what you just heard were some opening words from our dear friend Natividad Cano and brother David Bauer. And so they open us with their blessings, and we are thankful for the spaces that each of us live. And so now I'd like to introduce Todd Miller, who is an author and journalist, has written many books, including this latest one, Building Bridges, Not Walls, A Journey to a World Without Borders. He's written a lot about border issues, and so he's going to introduce, bring us some opening remarks. So Todd, I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Eric. I'm very grateful to be here with you all this morning. I think I'm going to start by going back to 2004, and I want to go to something that happened in Altar, Sonora, which is Altar is a place that's maybe about 75 miles to the south of the US-Mexico border on the Mexican side. And I was in Altar. It was 2004. I think it was February or maybe it was March of 2004. And I was working with the organization Border Links. And Border Links, what I was helping run an educational delegation we were in Altar. I was at the van and trying to get some of the students, I believe it was a university group, get some of the students back into the van. And as I was doing this, and probably a little bit frazzled, I remember being frazzled. A man came and touched my shoulder, and I looked over at the man. And mind you, we were in the central plaza of Altar. Altar is a small town of about 15,000 people. And it was a place where at the time, the routes, the kind of routes that people were taking to come across the border had shifted. So it had become a staging area. It still is a staging area for people about to cross the border through the desert. And so I was with a student group. I can't remember what university, but we were there, and we were in the central plaza, and we were talking to some of the people who were arriving, and the people were arriving by the busload. Really, you could sit there in the plaza at the time and watch bus after bus, and people would get off the buses, and a lot of people were coming from southern Mexico. A number of people are coming from Central America, and crossing, right, then going through the desert, this staging to cross in around the Sasabe area, which of course is where we have started the Migrant Trail Walk every year. And so the man touched my shoulder, and I was still a bit frazzled. So I kind of was only half listening at first, and then all of a sudden he said something that caught my full attention, and and I stopped what I was doing, and really for several minutes really ceased to care about getting the students back in the van. So the man he began to talk, and he said that his daughter had crossed through this area, probably around Sasabe, a couple months before. And she said that she would be in contact with him after she got to a safe place on the US side. She never contacted him. And so he had been in anguish for months. And he finally was able to scrape together enough money to come all the way from Huehuetenango in Guatemala to where we were. And he told me that story, and he said he was going to go on his own. He was going to go across the border, and he was going to go look for his daughter in the desert. And then he asked, "Is there anything can you help me do this?" And so, I mean, long story short, it was what he was trying to do seemed, at least, maybe it wasn't, but it seemed, at least in that moment, as almost an impossible task, right? Going and looking in the vast desert. And all I could do was I pointed him in the direction of Camin, which is the shelter in Altar, Sonora, to see if somebody might be able to help him there and give him guidance. Needless to say, that whole experience stuck with me then, in that moment. I mean, still to this day. But at that time, I came back I was back in Tucson, and I think probably many people here know Richard Boren. Richard Boren is a longtime activist, and I would meet up with Richard quite frequently. We'd just see each other in a cafe, or we'd meet up together. And every time we met, he would talk about trying to do some sort of march. If that's a term he used at first, a march from the border to Tucson. And I remember thinking, well, that sounds great, but that seemed also kind of hard, right? Like, how on earth would that happen? How would we pull that off? What would have to be done? But time and time again, Richard just kept bringing it up. And And it got to the point, and then after that experience with that man, for some reason, the next time I saw Richard and he brought it up, I was more along the lines of, so what are you thinking here? What do you think we could do to make something like this happen? And I got to talk. So we met again, and then finally, the only thing we could think of to do, and then another person from Border Links, a coworker of mine named Holly Hilburn, joined us, and in these small meetings. And for those familiar with Tucson, we were meeting in the Epic Cafe. So the Epic Cafe always has this whenever I pass by, it's not called the Epic anymore, but I think about that moment, because one of those meetings, we Holly, Richard, and I just said, well, there's one way we can do it. We can just say we're going to do it, right? We just can commit to walking from the border 75 miles, or I mean, we didn't know it was 75 miles at the time, or walking from the border to Tucson. And what at the time we were talking about, where there's a policies in place that are literally forcing people into the desert, and also to contextually at the time, and people were in the borderlands were very aware of what was going on in the desert. There was a lot of newer humanitarian aid organizations that were forming. By at that point, Humane Borders had formed and were putting water in the desert. Samaritans I began and were going out and looking for anybody in distress. And then No More Deaths was going to inaugurate in June of 2004. So that was coming right around the bend. So there was awareness, but the whole idea was to then, to shine at least at first, to shine the light even more by doing this walk. And I always find, so what we did basically was commit. We said we were going to do this no matter what. It doesn't matter if nobody joins in, we're still gonna do it and just see what happens. We're just gonna commit to it. And yeah. And so what happened after that, and I always, I guess I always find it, I mean, yeah, sure, I was one of the first people. I always have trouble with that word founder, but yeah, I really think the actual founding of it happened after that. And basically, Richard went to a meeting of the Coalición de Derechos Humanos maybe about a week later, and that's when he talked about this idea of doing this walk from the border, and to see if Derechos Humanos would be on board. And of course, that's when Kat Rodriguez joined in. And I always consider, Kat and what Kat has done and how Kat has carried the torch. And then and Kat, of course, and Margot Cohen and Guadalupe Castillo and all those people that were there that from those first days, who have carried the torch year after year after year ever since. I always really consider them to be more the founders. I feel like I'm just somebody who just said, I'll commit to it, and of course, but that first year, like Kat went into it a little bit in her opening remarks, but that first year was a lot of, organizing meetings. We didn't know, I personally had no idea what I was doing. We turned the Office of Border Links into basically a Migrant Trail Walk Committee office. We did all these trips down to the border to look at the different routes, and that sort of thing. And amazingly enough, I can't remember the number. I'm sure Kat has the number. I think it was like 40 of us, something like that. We did it. We did that first year, and the first year we actually began in Altar. So that was the only year I believe that was done. We started in Altar, and then made our way to Sasabe, and then from there crossed the border and walked what turned out to be the 75 miles from Sasabe to Tucson. And I still remember, like Kat said, there was no way could we ever possibly think we would mimic the actual journey that a person takes when they cross the border. Literally impossible. So it became more of a walk, like a procession, almost a walk of witness. And I remember, even so, like we had, and to this day in the trail walk, you have all this infrastructure, you have vehicles that accompany you, you have water, plenty of water, and all these organizations that sponsor from Tucson, who bring, or from around this southern borderlands, I should say, who bring food. But even then, even with all that, I remember that first year, my eyes burned. Like, I got burned eyes. I didn't even know that was possible, that you could get a sunburn on your eyes, and yet there it was. And I remember I couldn't even open up my eyelids, because once they were burned, they just started watering so incessantly. And those are just they're minor things, but they really kind of showed just in small ways, the hardship that happens when you're crossing through the desert. And I remember also the first year really thinking that, all these different things going on, and understanding there was a policy of the prevention through deterrence policy that was literally designed to make people go through the desert, and to shine the light on that, and to get the kind of media coverage that we got that first year, that there would be some sort of like impact that was made, that would be like, oh wow, here it is. This is obvious. The policy is a death policy, and it needs to be changed. And here we are, almost 2 decades later, like Kat mentioned. Here we are. Again, it even becomes more, I don't know, daunting to look back at what's happened since then. Like in 2004, if you remember, that's nearly 2 decades ago, and that's the year after Department of Homeland Security was implemented in 2003. And I believe the border and immigration enforcement budget in that year was about, I believe it was about $5 billion. If you took the first budgets from Customs and Border Protection and ICE and put them together, it was $5 billion. And then I was just looking at the 2023 proposed presidential budget, and it's $26 billion for border and immigration enforcement if you just count ICE. So really, or CBP and ICE. So CBP, of course, is the parent agency of the U.S. Border Patrol. So if you look over those years, and since that first year of the walk, and these mega budgets that have increased, all still within the policy of deterrence. And I should mention, even back in 2004, 2003, when you talk to U.S. Border Patrol, they would talk about deterrence. They would say that they would talk about it way more openly than they do now. They would say, oh, the desert is supposed to blockade people, and there's been so much, because of it's impossible to carry enough water, carry enough food, and it's the possibility of death was always in the original documents. That's why when you say death by design, it's there. It's, if you look at the 1994 Border Patrol memorandum, that's explicitly states that. And so so if you look back in those days, and that deterrence, you see the deterrence policy, and it's still in place, except they just don't mention it anymore. It's not even brought up hardly at all by, definitely not in the public discourse. And meanwhile, the budgets have meant, there was the Secure Fence Act of 2006 that brought 650 miles of walls and barriers. There's SBI Net, which basically built up the surveillance infrastructure that goes right along with the wall, that has the effect of forcing people into the desert even further. There were doubling of the Border Patrol from, I believe, 10,000 to 21,000. There's drones flying overhead. There's thousands and thousands of unintended motion sensors underneath. There's command and control centers, and I could go on and on and on. What has been done is the infrastructure of deterrence of forcing people into the desert has been doubled down upon since then. And it's to a point where we can sit here today, right? And as we talk and know at the beginning of summer, right, as we always start the Migrant Trail Walk in this week, end it in this weekend, that we know that people who are otherwise healthy right now are not going to be alive at the end of the summer, precisely because of this policy. And we could say that every single year. And it's so much that I would call it even a premeditated mass death event that is known beforehand. And so thinking of all this and actually going with Kat's lovely opening remarks and thinking about the Migrant Trail Walk, right? In terms of what Kat said as hope, right? There's still hope. It's amazing. It's amazing that we're still here on one hand, having to talk about this, and this policy repeats itself year after year, and the results we know ahead of time. And it's also amazing that we're here today, right? And the virtual trail walk event, and that the walk has happened year after year after year, and that the torch has been passed year after year after year, and it's been done as long as people keep dying in the desert. And I think there's something about the Migrant Trail Walk that is super powerful, that that this year after year consistency of bringing it, of coming to it, of doing it year after year is almost like the walk itself. And for me, and I'll end my remarks with this. Personally, it's doing the walk itself is a testament to this consistency, to this placing one foot in front of the other, in the walk, or coming back to doing the Migrant Trail Walk year after year after year, just doing it no matter what. It almost goes back to that original commitment. No matter what happens, we're going to keep doing this. And I always think back, I've done the trail walk myself 4 times. I haven't done it, and well, of course the pandemic's affected it. Hopefully maybe the policies changed and we'll never have to do it again. But if it had, but anyhow, long story short, I have done it 4 times myself, and every single time, maybe not the first time was a little bit we're a work in progress. But the other times I always start the trail walk off with some ambitions, like I'm going to write this thing, or I'm going to do this thing on the walk, or I'm going to think about this. I always have these personal ambitions, and generally, unless there's something I really have to do, but generally those ambitions go by the side by day 3 or day 4 of the walk. And by day 3 or day 4, the personal ambitions, my own personal ambitions, go melt away. And it's to the point where my personal ambitions mean absolutely nothing to the more collective purpose of just putting one foot in front of the other, the collective purpose of getting this group of people to Tucson. And that is it. That's all, for me, that's all that I'm suddenly it's no longer me. I've become part of this bigger group, this bigger thing. And to me, that sort of thing is one of the most powerful things about the walk. And it's so much, and granted, you have your challenges on the walk and this and that, but by the end of the walk and arriving to Kennedy Park, and the greeting, like Kat mentioned, the welcoming of people, and how that should be how it is, that people coming across the border should be applauded. Like every time I walk into Kennedy Park, I start to weep, right, as I walk, as people start to applaud as we walk into that park. And then that also comes from this kind of collective, almost beautiful place of, even though we're like the walking wounded in a lot of ways. I remember that first year I felt like I could walk all the way to Washington, D.C. It didn't have to stop. Like, and then I also felt in other walks that I could walk down back to the border, in 3 days, and just, there's some sort of, and I don't mean it in personal, I mean in collective power, tear down the border wall with my bare hands. And those are the kinds of really inspired feelings of this consistency and moving and becoming this feeling, or just literally not even a feeling, becoming a part of something much bigger than yourself. And that's the gift, I think, of the trail walk. And that's why I think um you know I'm glad, I'm again have all the gratitude to be here with you today, and the honor to be with you today. And I'm super excited about the rest of the day and the panels that will happen as we bring forth the walk with words today. And I'll just leave it at that, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you for all of that, and for the inspiration and the work that you did to make this come about. It is both a blessing and a tragedy that we continue to walk, and hoping in 2023 that, of course, the policies will change, and that we won't have to. But unfortunately, that is highly unlikely. For those of you, so we have a few people that I know have not been on the walk before, and so I just want to share real quick. This is where we start from. So this is Sasa Bay, Mexico, right here, and we walk through the Buenos Aires Wild Refuge here, and we end up going up on Route 286 and then 86, and this is where we end up here in Kennedy Park in Tucson. And so that is approximately the 75 miles. We walk a lot of highway, but also through the Buenos Aires, where a lot of folks have crossed in the past. And so I just want to give you all a sense of that. We are going to take a break right now. I'm going to invite folks to take a bio break, take care of your needs, drink water, lots of water, because we do live in a desert today. And whether you're joining us from all parts of the world, today we are in a desert that is unfortunately a difficult tragedy. So thank you, Todd. We'll be back here in approximately 15 minutes. So that's 9 o'clock Arizona time. Yes.
5 minutes. 5 minutes. Sorry.
5 minutes. It says 9 o'clock. Panel
Oh.
1.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well,
yeah, the
but
timing's a little off. So, well, we can start early.
Well, that's good. That's good. 15 minutes. So
Okay.
that gives folks a good break, and then we're on schedule.
We did
Imagine
plan
that.
this. This has been planned for months. We're not throwing it together at the last second. So, but yeah, come back in 15 minutes. So it's 9 o'clock Arizona time when we'll come back. So figure that out for your time zone, and we'll be back shortly. Kat, just in the chat just now, Kat did put up the schedule for today. There's a link there, so if you would like to look at that, feel free to do that. That is on the website, so you can see kind of where we're going with this. And we'll announce that again when we come back.
Mis hermanas y hermanos también se cruzaron a morir con el sueño de una vida mejor. Adiós a mi Juan, adiós Rosalita, adiós mis amigos, Jesús y María, no los nombraron cuando se murieron, solo les llamaron los deportados, solo les llamaron los deportados. El avión explotó sobre un monte en Los Gatos, como bola de fuego a la tierra cayó. ¿Quiénes son estos cuerpos que no tienen nombres? Solo son deportados, la radio anunció. Y así es la vida de una campesina, y así es la vida de un trabajador, por ir a sudar y sufrir en los campos, y solo le llaman un deportado. Adiós a mi Juan, adiós Rosalita, adiós mis amigos, Jesús y María, no los nombraron cuando se murieron, solo les llamaron los deportados, solo les llamaron los deportados.
Primer día del año, Chiapas, México, el indio maya, 4 pueblos tomó.
Sonó la campana por todo el mundo, que Emiliano Zapata ya se levantó.
Viene exigiendo tierra, quiere su libertad, que pare la violencia contra el indígena. Salinas de Gortari, las tropas mandó, tanques y aeroplanos contra la rebelión.
Y los zapatistas preso tomaron a Castellanos Domínguez, el exgobernador.
Viene exigiendo tierra, quiere su libertad, que pare la violencia contra el indígena.
So as we start to come back, we have I'm gonna ask our panelists. Let's see, we've got Kat. Are you there yet? There you are. And Eddie, you have a PowerPoint, correct?
There's a couple of slides that I sent in a bit late to Kat this morning. I hope, thank you, Kat, for getting that up. I mean, yeah, it's just kind of a summary effort on our part over here in Texas that I want to cover. And, you know, it really is an honor to be part of this panel. You know, this Migrant Trail, you know, in the history that it has, you know, for so many years. And also want to recognize my fellow board members, Isabel Garcia and Pedro, who are on the panel.
We're gonna get
Eddie,
started in just a little bit. We're not
Okay.
quite there yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to verify. I have a PowerPoint that Kat had sent to me, and I just want to make sure that that I have that set up correctly. That's all. So yeah, we'll get going in just a little bit. Sorry,
Okay.
sorry, I didn't mean to get you going right away.
Sorry, Eddie.
My bad.
That's okay. Yeah, I've been listening to the music, and you know, and Todd's presentation was very, very lightning, and just a wonderful day to you know, to be part of this. And you know, so I'm patient.
No worries.
So the order will be I don't know, we could go geographically in order. You know, we could go for California, Arizona, Texas. Or does it matter? Do any of you want to be the first? I mean, it could be either way.
I don't mind being first.
Okay. Well, then we'll go east to west then, if that's all right. Or maybe we'll have Eddie, then Pedro, and then Lupe will be the closer. Let's do that. We'll do that. So it just did 2 more minutes, and let's see. So the format will be each of you has 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will have 30 minutes of Q&A. There's a Q&A box at the bottom that folks will be popping up questions. You don't have to worry about that. I will be reading you the questions and then asking you to respond. So I might pick one of you, or it might be directed at one of you to respond. So you don't have to worry about the little alerts popping up there. I will read the questions to you. And let's see. And that's it. It'll, you know, it's a pretty straightforward format. And we will start in about a minute. So if you want to get a last sip of water, I know I'm going to get a last sip of water. Oh, and on the questions, there might be some questions that are more than one question asking the same thing. So I might sometimes combine the questions just to make it, to make us try to get through as many of the questions as possible. And let's see. So it's 9 o'clock here in Arizona. We're going to go ahead and start our panel. Panel 1 is called Looking Back, How Did We Get Here? A History of Racism, a Legacy of Impunity. I'm going to be moderating this panel. I will be introducing each of the speakers. They will each have 15 to 20 minutes to talk, and then we will have 30 minutes for Q&A. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little Q&A box. Feel free to put those questions into the box at whatever time makes sense to you, so that it will pose those to the speakers. They won't be addressing them during their talk. It'll be during the Q&A session that follows. And okay, I think we'll go ahead and start. I think we're gonna go Eddie, and then we'll do Pedro, and then we'll have Lupe. So let's see, I'm just gonna. Where'd it go? Looking for your little bio, 1 second. Okay, so we're going to start with Eduardo Eddie Canales from the South Texas Human Rights Center. Eddie has a wonderful longer bio that is on our website, and all of our speakers have their bios on the website. So I'm going to just read a few things so that we can have him jump right into his talk. Eddie Canales was born in Corpus Christi, Texas, of migrant farm worker parents. He spent his early years in rural migrant border town of Salineno, Texas. His grandparents and parents worked the farm worker crops migrating all over the Midwest and West. He is currently the director and lead organizer and one of the founders of the South Texas Human Rights Center, advocating for human rights and for the prevention of migrant deaths in the Rio Grande Valley, Texas-Mexico border, and an original organizer of the Corpus Christi Immigration Coalition, fighting for immigrant rights. And I will turn it over to you, Eddie.
Thank you, Kat. It's an honor to be part of this panel. And, you know, in terms of the long history that the Migrant Trades panel has over the years, I'm also, you know, want to recognize, you know, Isabel Garcia and Pedro, who are part of the panel, and my fellow board members of the National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. I sent out, there's a small slide. Is that coming up there a little bit? I mean, I can, there you go. We're part of the Forensic Border Coalition, which is, you see there, we're doing, the Forensic Border Coalition was formulated way back in 2013, at the same time that the South Texas Human Rights Center was founded. It includes the South Texas Human Rights Center, Operation Identification out of the Forensic Center, Forensic Anthropology Center, Texas State, the Colibri Center for Human Rights in Tucson, and also the Equipo Forense Antropológico de Argentina, who initiated our efforts in terms of finding the unidentified here in Texas. And Todd Miller mentioned that, that maybe it's not mentioned as enough, but the prevention through deterrence policy is it's basically, as he described it, premeditated deaths, collateral deaths in terms of the policy that takes place. We do have sometimes talk in terms of those deaths, being extrajudicial state violence created by the policy. So death by policy is clearly something that we're been dealing with over the last years, since 1994, in terms of when that policy was implemented. Now, the number of deaths, of course, is not accurate or what is recorded now. But there's estimates up to 20,000 plus. People, the number that have been recovered, it doesn't nearly cover the total number of deaths on a total wide border. Let me get my clock going here, make sure I don't run over. But And again, here in 2012, Texas began to surpass Arizona in terms of the number of the higher rates of death in South Texas, which is the Rio Grande Valley. And that is concentrated on, of course, we all deal with the checkpoints that are, the militarized checkpoints that exist all over the southwest border between Mexico and the United States. So in Brooks County, where the South Texas Human Rights Center is located, we're roughly, it's 60 miles, north of the border. And there is, to the checkpoints, and people having to make that effort to get around those checkpoints is what's causing, and of course it's mostly on foot. People are following migrant trails, they're on foot. 90% of that, 96% of that land is privately owned. So people are going through private ranches where create some other issues regarding the involvement of, ranchers being part of what I refer to as surveillance, snitching, in terms of where people are coming through, and therein creates a lot of the politics with some of the conservative ranchers. This is different than Arizona in terms of the public lands that people go through in Arizona. In Texas, and I'm making the comparison to what Arizona has in terms of everything concentrated at Pima County Medical Examiner System. Texas has only 14 MEs, and those are concentrated in most of the metropolitan areas in the state of Texas. And there's no medical examiner system in South Texas. And therein, the burden lies on the justice of the peace to come out and go out into the brush and declare the body, declare the time of death and the cause of death, which is generally just at the time they get there, and the elements in terms of how they rule on the cause of death. There is the law in Texas requires that DNA be taken, but in a lot of these counties, a lot of the DNA was not taken, and that's where we're uncovering in terms of our efforts to uncover the unidentified bodies in South Texas. Okay, there you go. There you go. Thank you. Yeah, back to the first slide, please. There you go. I just want to mention that in, the vast majority of the unidentified remains in South Texas are buried in unmarked graves without DNA sampling or proper documentation. And that's really the reality we've been dealing with. Brooks County alone, over 225 bodies have been taken from the Sacred Heart Burial Park, in terms of probably a 6 to 7 year gap in Brooks County where bodies were just being buried without any DNA taken. And there's no record of that being approved by the county officials, the county commissioners of officials. And it was just somebody's decision, the county judge's decision to said anything south of Creek Road, goes to a mortuary in Mission, Texas, that was unprepared and ill-equipped to take any DNA for all those recovered bodies. So, and there's a mention here that, FBC, basically Operation Identification, I remember. And I want to mention also that the South Texas Human Rights Center was founded also by Maria Jimenez and myself, in terms of Maria reaching out to me. And, when I was down here in Texas and saying, hey, Eddie, can you help? In terms of the initial beginnings of what was going on. And of course, there were two things: is all private property, no DNA being taken, and by the officials, and then no set mechanisms really there to do any rescue or recovery in that respect. So I'm the other slide, so we began that process to send the bodies in 2013. The bodies were being sent to that mortuary. So in August of 2013, it was the first advocacy that the center was able to change in terms of the bodies going to a mortuary, a medical examiner system in Webb County. And that did create additional problems in terms of where, in terms of some of the sense of the cooperation of the medical examiner there, not being, really collaborative to any degree. And we're having our own issues with extracting, autopsy reports of different entities, and also the death certificates that were, she was holding back on the death certificates that weren't being completed. So let me just kind of switch over to the other side, to the other, there you go, thank you. And this is the kind of just kind of a sketch. We did that. This is for public information in terms of us being able to get some of this information out to the community, and doing some degree of education regarding, the migrant death cycles that have begun in South Texas. So ME or JP system in the county, in terms of the remains being recovered. And I'm going to say that nothing is systematic, nothing is deliberate in terms of the recovery of bodies. Everything is recovered incidental to ranchers, hunters, border patrol, or other personnel being in these ranches and finding these bodies, and then calling out the entity, the law enforcement entity, which in these cases it would be the county sheriff and their deputies coming out and do the transport to the ME, or a pathologist, a contracted pathologist, like in Cameron County, that Dr. Elizabeth Miller is the contracted forensic pathologist. It's all privatized in South Texas in terms of where, in terms of not having a regional medical examiner system. So as I mentioned, the JP pronounces the dead, and then we were often dealing with the remains getting buried without any DNA taken. I'm going to review some of that stuff here at the end in terms of how far we've made some advances. So exhumation, has been part of the project that the FBC, the Forensic Border Coalition, has undertaken. Mercedes Dorenti with El Grupo Argentino was very, very involved in the very beginning, and us in terms of trying to figure out how many bodies can we recover, or burials can be recovered in all these counties in South Texas. And the Cameron County, Hidalgo County, Starr County, these are border counties, Zapata County, these are border counties that are contingent right on the border. And then the other counties, Jim Hogg and Brooks County, Willacy County, and Kennedy County. All those counties also have had migrant bodies recovered in their jurisdiction. So the effort is to get the DNA taken as has been once we did that in 2013, it was the same year that the center was founded. In August of 2013, then everything was being done according to state law as the proper DNA being registered. The process, though, and I don't know what the time frame is there in Arizona. I should know, but because DNA goes into University of North Texas, here in Texas, and who was housing the National Human Identification Center and also managing NAMUS, that whole process for families. If there's a recovered body with an identification and that body cannot be identified through fingerprints or dental records, then that person, then the DNA goes into some of these, goes into UNT, as also the family reference sample will. So that process takes close to a year right now. And that is, a lot of family members are assuming, because of the personal effects that are found with the body and some other items that are found with the body, assuming that that is their loved one, but they cannot claim the body until a positive identification can be made. So, again, we're dealing with a lot of the FBC has taken charge in terms of trying to do, the better protocols in terms of best practices and stuff. And that's it. I'm going to refer to a manual that Dr. Raquel Rubio Goldsmith started in terms of back in 2012 or 2011, in terms of some of the practices that were taken there in Texas, and what needs to be upgraded to some degree in terms of everything that deals with all the protocols regarding the recovery of unidentified human remains. We still need a lot of change. We're, in terms of what has taken, how far we've moved. We are advocating, we continue to advocate for a regional medical examiner system, including there to serve Star, Hidalgo, Cameron, Brooks, and other border counties that are very close to the Migrant Trail there. There is no political will for that to happen. We were anticipating that Hidalgo County, which has McAllen and the bridges, the Reynosa Bridge, would meet the threshold of population in a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years back, in terms of reaching that threshold of 1 million and being mandated to do a medical examiner system. That threshold was changed to 2 million, and therefore they punted, and we're still in the same situation where there is not an ME system that can really facilitate for the greater good. And I'm not just talking in terms of migrant bodies. I'm talking for the overall aspect of a medical examiner system that can serve South Texas. In continuing those efforts in terms of creating political will, with Texas State and Operation Identification, we're doing a study right now on migrant death practices. It's sort of like a review again of everything that was done in the manual that Raquel Rubio Goldsmith developed, trying to get it updated to some degree. But as we find here in Nueces County, and I'm in Nueces County right now in Corpus Christi, that there's an ME system here, and it's had very, very, very unstable situation. But the facility could be developed here that will serve all of South Texas. In that regards, and that we're trying to create that process and that political will in terms of having staffing up to a forensic coordinator person beyond myself in terms of being able to move that situation within all the political entities that exist. A lot of dynamics are taking place down here in South Texas regarding the politics of the Republicans and the right and Trumpsters in that regard. So it's a challenging situation in terms of us being able to create a better situation for the general community. Also, you see on that black box right there that enforced death certificates completion and case tracking in accordance with state law. The medical examiner and in Webb County this past year, 2021, Brooks County had 119 recovered bodies and remains. At least 100, or if not more than that, of those bodies were identified through fingerprints. We had developed the Missing Migrants program in South Texas, and there at the Falfurrias checkpoint with station with the South Texas Human Rights Center, in terms of us develop some protocols for Border Patrol to do some searches, do some recovery, some rescue, and so we moved that, and it was working to some degree. Of course, the politics is that Border Patrol needed some good PR or saying that they're doing humanitarian effort, but it all depended on us pushing them to do the recoveries and do the rescue. So we've been able to continue that, but it has COVID in itself put things on the back burner, and it did develop the process for Border Patrol to enhance their processes of fingerprints, of taking pictures of recovered bodies and fingerprints, and that's why I say that over 100 of those recovered bodies in Brooks County were identified through fingerprints, and if that were already in the system. And if they were not in the system, the consulates would request an official fingerprint from their home country and do the comparison in terms of us being able to identify it. I mean, and it was in a sense very, very important process that happened, because it was just 119 almost reached the total number in 2012 of 130. So recovered bodies and remains. So there is also in that box that there is not a designated area for some of the unidentified cases to be buried, and so maybe something that we'll continue to push for. And then that all the unidentified cases are entered into NAMAs. Just recently, some legislation was passed that this is compelling, but there's no mandate in terms of the enforcement mechanism in terms of that happening. And so it'll be incumbent on us to try to figure out how these counties, these sheriff's departments are sending all the data of unidentified human remain into NAMA, so that there is a possible search and identification. So we're continue to continue our efforts right now in terms of the center having water stations and continuing those efforts, and having a hotline, and also trying to increase our capacity right now in terms of trying to make our efforts a little bit stronger. So I'm gonna close it at that. We're supporting reforms that allows for safe migration under the Global Compact, calling for a safe, orderly, and regular migration. And how do you promote those pathways? I just recovered found out there's going to be about 120 plus H2A workers doing watermelon picking in Brooks County. So how we, that's a regularization process, and then how do we enhance those? So let me close there, and I think I'm close to the 20 minutes, and hopefully that gives everybody a overview of how Texas is as compared to Arizona. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eddie. We are going to jump from Texas over to California, and I'm pleased to introduce Pedro Rios from the American Friends Service Committee. He is the director of the American Friends Service Committee's U.S.-Mexico Border Program and has worked for AFSC since 2003. He oversees a program that documents abuses by law enforcement agencies, collaborates with community groups, advocates for policy change, and works with migrant communities to build collective leadership locally and throughout the border region. He has a master's in ethnic studies from San Francisco State University, and he's a photographer and writer. So without further ado, Pedro Rios.
Thank you, Kat, and thank you to everyone who is joining this morning. And it's also an honor for me to be here and to share this space with so many wonderful people. The title of this panel, Looking Back, How Did We Get Here? History of Racism, a Legacy of Impunity, got me thinking a little bit about one phrase, one chant that oftentimes is used in different spaces. It's, we didn't cross the border crossed us. Many of you probably have heard it at some point or another at events protesting border patrol brutality, impunity, border walls, militarization of our communities. And so it's not one that's probably unfamiliar to you. But for many people, this chant resonates because it reminds us of a political history of how the border was delineated between the United States and Mexico. That in mind, that in the mid 1800s, the US waged a war of aggression against the newly minted Republic of Mexico then, and its northern territory was up for contention. And ultimately, really all of Mexico was, if we remind ourselves of the hymn for the Marines, where they talk about, from the halls of Moctezuma and so on and so forth. And so it tells the tale, or it presents the idea that that the border delineage was formed through unfettered violence, and a violence driven in part by a white supremacist ideology that began to reimagine colonization in this newer nation state format of who belongs and who doesn't belong to the United States. So again, we didn't cross the border crossed us. For me, it speaks of a very personal familial history. My paternal grandparents both were born in Los Angeles, and while having US citizenship, they were still picked up by immigration authorities and sent packing to Mexico in the 1930s, along with hundreds of thousands of other US citizens of Mexican ancestry. In my grandmother's case, as a teenager and under care of an aunt who was dating a bootlegger, well, it so happened that bootlegger was caught bootlegging. And so the INS took him, my grandmother's aunt, my grandmother and her siblings, and deported them to Mexico. My grandmother had never been to Mexico before, so imagine her surprise finding herself in a land that was really strange and foreign to her. My grandfather's case is much simpler. He was poor, orphaned at a very young age. He was a very dark-skinned Mexican, so didn't fit the profile of someone, according to his white supremacist ideology of who belongs and who doesn't, of someone who belonged in the US. So his removal from the US was swift, like many others, during the repatriation program of the 1930s. And this happened from 1929 to 1939, approximately during the Great Depression, where it's estimated that up to 1 million people were deported. And there was a similar period in history 20 years later called Operation Wetback, a very demeaning, degrading term to call an operation. And as I think it was in 2015 when Trump was running for president, he referenced it by praising President Eisenhower about having removed so many people way south. In other words, he was indicating that that could also be a viable option, policy option that he could take in 2015, thinking back of the not only the 1930s, but also in the 1950s. So 75 years later, the same sort of logic for how to remove people was still something that was prevalent for someone that was running for office, for the highest office in the United States. But the border has not always been militarized. Even before the US and Mexico made any claim to land, it's always important to recognize the indigenous peoples that had been here for generations, the Kumeyaay in California and other indigenous peoples in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas inhabited the Southwest for generations. And now their descendants must contend with these physical monstrosities, these structures that partition the lands their ancestors traversed through without any barriers. So the legacy of violence and impunity, even since the formation of the Border Patrol in 1924, predates, I would say, more recent and atrocious Trump-era policies that systematically have caused so much harm that we're all quite aware of. When the Border Patrol was created in 1924 to enforce immigration restrictions, there wasn't a clear mandate from Congress. Nonetheless, for decades afterwards, there remained a few physical barriers between the US and Mexico, but this started changing, and what I would like to describe as policies of war. And so if we look at the different presidencies, there's always a sense of warring policy that frames how border policies are made. And so in the late 60s, under the Nixon administration, when he began fighting the war on drugs at the border through an operation called Intercept. And this was run, and for those of you from Arizona might recognize his name, this was run by the future anti-immigrant Joe Arpaio. The piecemeal enforcement of those years became much more formalized under Ronald Reagan, and I know I skipped President Carter. President Carter had the tortilla curtain. Some of you might be aware of that, which again, a battle about what lands belong to the US and what lands belong to Mexico, and the building the tortilla curtain along a certain area where the first much more modern, if I can call that, of border wall erected during the Carter administration, about 6 miles of this type of border wall. And under Reagan, of course, in 1986, he had the war on poor people, really, and targeting people. And in 86, under IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which essentially was a trade-off for about 3 million people that were able to adjust their immigration status. But then that came together with increased worksite enforcement, employer sanctions, as well as increased targeting of border communities with militarization. Following his presidency under George Bush father, his administration introduced a much more punitive approach to immigration. His Attorney General, William Barr, who was also the Attorney General under Trump, oversaw the expansion of immigrant detention and a push to eliminate due process rights for immigrants with so-called criminal convictions. In 1989, the administration launched Joint Task Force 6, which was a much more coordinated effort of military support with the Pentagon, and it included military creating a sense of where border states then became the playground, if you will, for these drug interdiction efforts. And this, in many ways, foreshadowed the increased tragedies of targeting of border residents, with the killing of Ezequiel Hernandez in 1997 by a platoon of Marines who followed him and essentially sniped him from a distance away in Redford, Texas. And this raised a lot of questions about the role of the military at the border. And it just so happened that last month, on the 20th of May, we reached the 25th anniversary of that tragedy that ended the life of Ezequiel Hernandez. And to me, I think in reviewing a lot of the files from that incident, what was particularly interesting, especially in terms of how the court case moved forward, was how revealing it was that this platoon of Marines and really all the law enforcement agencies involved in this operation, how all of Redford, Texas, every single individual in Redford, Texas was considered a potential suspect. And this creation of suspicion, overall suspicion, was really blanketed throughout Redford, but really a microcosm for how residents throughout border communities have been living under increased militarization of their communities, of where they live, where they pray, where they work, where they go to school. It was in this same environment, so that happened in 1997, but it was in this same environment against the backdrop of rising nativist sentiment under the Clinton administration that Operation Gatekeeper was launched in October of 1994. So keeping in mind, speaking from California, that California at that point had been debating an extremely nativist anti-immigrant proposition known as Proposition 187, which used the same word, suspicion. So if you suspect of someone being undocumented, of course, they use the derogatory term to refer to people without documents. If you suspected of them, then it obligated people that worked in civil service industry, so police, educators, medical field staff, to have to report those individuals they suspected of being undocumented to immigration authorities. So this idea of suspicion then becomes woven into not only the language of popular discourse, but also into policy, also into the operations that get rolled out into our communities. So under Clinton, then Operation Gatekeeper, which follows also the North American Free Trade Agreement between Mexico, United States, and Canada, that provided free trade for products, but really buttressed against the militarization of our communities with more boots on the ground, with more technology in use, with the increase of border wall construction in various communities, and that disrupted border communities by instituting checkpoints and all this infrastructure that I've pointed out to. So it's not necessarily a case of only impacting those who are crossing through the borderlands, migrants, but also residents of border communities in this with a heavy footprint of militarization. The Border Patrol's rationale was this idea of territorial denial. That's what they use. If you have so many agents in place that they would deny entry to anyone, and that it would make it harder then for people to cross the border into the US. And policymakers then theorized that people might not cross the border at all by making it risky and potentially a deadly journey. But obviously this didn't happen, as Eddie was commenting in terms of the number of people that have died in their attempts to cross into the US and that continue to die, and that we continue to see record numbers of deaths, especially in Arizona, and even increasingly so in the eastern portions of California. The increase of militarization then of our communities as a result or stemming from Gatekeeper pushed people to take these much more treacherous routes. And so, we don't know the numbers for sure. We do know that Border Patrol consistently and strategically undercounts the number of border deaths, but we know that number has surpassed 10,000. And then that's likely a much more conservative estimate of how many people have died in their attempts to cross into the U.S. And as Todd was mentioning, in terms of the premeditated aspect of this, there's a quote by I'm trying to find it here. A quote by the former commissioner of the INS, Doris Meissner, and she said in the year 2000, we did believe that geography would be an ally to us. It was our sense that the number of people crossing the border through Arizona would go down to a trickle once people realize what it's like. And so, others have written about how, and she mentions that nature or geography would be an ally to her. Others have written how nature was weaponized in this sense, because the purposeful redirection of migration routes through these treacherous lands, these treacherous terrain, made it so death would be part of the equation of the prevention through deterrence. So death would be a viable option for deterring people who intended to cross into the US. And so as people found out about those deaths, that they likely would make the decision of not crossing. And we know that that's not been the case. But what we also know is that those policies of death continue to this day. And if we look, for instance, at the more recent policies, again, derived from racist thinking, the application of the CDC order Title 42 that uses the pandemic as an excuse to not only deny migrants their due process rights, but also flaunt any respect to federal law and to international agreements by the US to recognize asylum procedures. It forces people to have to wait in Mexico by pushing them away, by expelling them, making them not have any other options when they're attending to seek asylum by arriving at the ports, where Customs and Border Protection officers will call Mexican authorities to push migrants who have arrived at the ports intending to make an asylum claim and push them away, and forces them to take these extreme routes. And so we are reaching a year. On June 7th, it'll be a year when Vice President Harris was in Guatemala, and she made those now infamous statements in her speech: do not come, do not come. There are legal ways for people to seek asylum, and we know that's not true, what we see on the ground. And so Title 42, the migrant protections protocols, and even before then, the metering process that CBP was using to have migrants wait in Mexico for their turn, supposedly, are ways of frustrating migrants and creating a situation where desperation then is what makes them make a decision of how to cross into the US. And so there are other aspects, I think, well, let me just finish that thought. And so these then lead to increased deaths, increased injuries. We see that 5 times more people are falling from border walls, dying, increasingly getting traumatic, serious injuries, and even medical doctors, at least in San Diego, have been speaking out about this. The 30-foot wall was devised after psychological field tests that Border Patrol did determine that 22 feet was high enough to disorient someone. Well, at that point, what will that person do? They will either fall or to their deaths or to a serious injury. And so in the last couple of minutes that I have, I just want to say that there are other aspects of this larger militarization aspect of how Border Patrol has operated. And my hope is that you'll hear other speakers and other panels speak about the critical incident teams and how Border Patrol conducts investigations without any authority by Congress, for instance, and how there are different challenges that have been made to that. There are increased confrontations between civil society and Border Patrol agents because of the number of agents in the field. And all of this obviously has a real direct impact on our lives. Despite the violence and the expansion of border militarization, especially even through surveillance technologies, the border region has always been a place of cultural exchange, one that reflects a dynamic social and economic relationship between our neighboring communities. And so going back to the chant that I started with, we didn't cross the border crossed us. My hope is that that also serves as a way for us to think of more dynamic ways of building relationships with our neighboring communities, and really striving for a politic that uplifts dignity, a politic that is based on human rights for the protection of those that are crossing through our borderlands, but also those of us that call the borderlands home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pedro. Wow, that was wonderful. All right, let me jump right in. And folks, if you have any questions, please feel free to start putting those in the Q&A box at the bottom. And because we're going to go right into the Q&A following Guadalupe Castillo from Keep Tucson Together. She's a retired history professor at Pima Community College in Tucson, as well as an activist in the Chicano Civil Rights Movement. Born and raised in Tucson, Arizona, Lupe is a co-founder of the University of Arizona's Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. In 1970, she helped organize Tucson residents to establish the El Rio Neighborhood Center and fought to build the Joaquin Murrieta Park on Tucson's west side. Today, she continues to work with the Keep Tucson Together project and has been present for every migrant trail. Okay, take it away, Lupe.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. I really feel honored to be with all the people from the Migrant Trail and others who have joined in today. First of all, I want to thank Eddie for mentioning Maria Jimenez, who is now in the spirit world. Maria is very crucial to the history, the recent history of the border. And also Pedro, who began with a very important aspect that I will focus on, and that is the deep history of the border. Because if we do not speak about the deep history of the border, what we are relegated to within the public policy of the United States as kind of a bad sore that sits there on the southern border to be used as a prop by politicians in every election. And it's minimized, marginalized, unimportant. So when public policy is being enunciated, legislation is being established, the region is relegated to next time. And so I think it is important for us to therefore make sure that we understand the totality of complexity of this region. That first of all, that deep history begins with what Natividad Cano said to us this morning, and the indigenous presence, which is the most foundational for us in this region. It is to this day as active as it was from time immemorial. Okay. It goes into mythic time. We can cite, for example, the great journey that is told of the movement from Aztlán to the south to establish Mexico. Okay, so that is how profound our history is. And it is a north-south geographical spatial history that is avoided and banned from being taught. And so that is where we have to begin. In that profound history, we should know the history, not only of the indigenous peoples that populated this north-south corridors, but of all of the indigenous communities that we call the United States. I mean, we should not even begin a history of the United States without knowing the history of the indigenous peoples that were part of these land masses before the arrival of Europeans. So I think that that's very important. And it is not today a history that is a dead history of indigenous communities in museums. These are living communities. Like just to cite, here in Arizona, you have over 20 indigenous communities speaking their native language, living in their cultural time and establishing their own way of life that they continue to do outside of being part of the United States. Okay, so I think that that's where we have to begin, with that enormous, profound presence of history. And then, and not to isolate and say, well, that was in the past. These communities are vibrant, growing, very much part of our presence, and whose hearts were pierced by the imposition of the border in separating their communities, right? And so we have to keep that as part of the history. The other part of the history is the invasion and conquest of this section of starting from Mexico and going north and into Central America and South America, of the invasion by Spain, a global empire that invaded and then moved quickly from Mexico City in 1521 all the way into California, across what today we call, the California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, into Florida, and establish its presence as a global empire. So right there, you have the beginning of the presence of the fight over these lands by European nations. The Russians coming from Alaska, the French coming from Canada, the English, the Dutch, and later we will, the Portuguese, all of them. And bringing into the display Africa as well, so that the border area contains all of this global presence, and that we have to understand, because institutions, culture, all of these elements that form communities came to be imposed by force, and that is very important for us to understand. That there were the ports of California, for example, were very desirable because they allowed the travel of ships from California into China and into the South Pacific. So all of that travel, all the way from the Philippines to California, to Baja California, to Acapulco, across to Veracruz, and then Havana, and then to Sevilla. That was part of the border region. And why Tucson, Texas, Florida, Cuba, and California were fortified to prevent the takeover of the wealth that the Spanish global empire considered to be important and in their interest. And following that, as Pedro pointed out, the independence of Mexico, and then the establishment of the border. The establishment of the border, as Pedro pointed out, was not, okay, this separates us, a natural separation that occurred. No, it was imposed by invasion and conquest. And it was established in war. And it was established, as Pedro said, by the invasion of the United States and the conquering of Mexico City. And to save Mexico City, the government of Mexico conceded that they would cede the lands to the north. Otherwise, they would lose all of Mexico. And so that is an important history. It's much more complicated, more nuanced, but we have to understand that. Okay, and then the structures that have been imposed since then, based on race, based on force of presence of colonial institutions that were imposed and practices that were imposed in these regions to have control. I think that it is also important, and this is what the banning of books is, when we talk about the history of the resistance, of the resistances to all of this, of how people resisted for every single thing I have mentioned. There were resistances that were underlying every presence of conquest. No matter if it was a small community, a larger presence. I think that is very important for us to understand. The history of the United States is a history of movement from east to west. And the history I have been summarizing is a movement north and south from mythic times, right? And so when these two histories intersect, not only do they intersect horizontally, they come into clash with each other, but also vertically. Okay, so it is a very profound intersectionalities that we see playing out in these regions. We can see it, for example, just to give you an example, we can see it in the way that mining towns were established. Okay, and the control that was held. Not only was it controlled by the way companies ran the mining towns, which dated often from practices of the Spanish Empire, but now the capitalists from the United States imposed these of segregation, paying less wages, the dual wage system. There were all of these, turning, in other words, people who were natives into now the foreigners. Those of us who were native were now the foreigners and intruders, and therefore had to be controlled and placed into isolated open detention camps called reservations or barrios or whatever was led to advance the interest of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny made this presence of the United States and its institutions as inevitable. This is what was normal. This was what was good, because this was a country based in a Constitution and Declaration of Independence, without integrating into it as, in the resistance we have tried to bring into play, the exclusion of slavery, the inclusion of the genocide against indigenous communities, the invasion conquest that were present all over, that was part of the norm for those who were conquered, but in resistance. And manifest destiny then tried to normalize what was this colonial imposition by a nation state. And today, I would even submit that when we talk about, we don't talk about manifest destiny anymore, but we call it something different, American exceptionalism. And we all buy into it. And so when we look at the border, then we have to understand the different levels of cycles, as one anthropologist once called it, Spicer, the cycles of conquest, the impositions that were there, and how these have come to impact in terms of the borderlands, so that it is possible, for example, for the presence of the Border Patrol, the presence of the military, as in Task Force 6, the presence of the police forces, the presence of the Texas Rangers, the presence of all of these groups, and that is normal. That should be how we live, or to create the barrios, right? We live in barrios. And why are barrios segregated? And why the reservations and so forth. So we have to understand and analyze, and as the vocabulary today, to question all of these, and it's a history that is not the normal history, as we would expect it from the nation state. Certainly, when we look at the resistances of our communities, they come in all very different forms. I mean, within Mexico, within the United States, we see all communities that have used resistance as a way of establishing and overthrowing these very deeply rooted in structural racism and practices as well. Practices that makes it normal for somebody to live over there, but you are not able to buy a house because you are a different background. And so, like all of you know the history of Chavez Ravine, right? And Dodger Stadium, where people were literally dragged out of their houses, literally taken out of their houses so that a baseball stadium could be built. Because one of the things we have to look at is the establishment of a capitalist system that then needed labor and brought labor in to establish the great industries of this greater area, whether it was agriculture, whether it was infrastructure building, whether it was the building of dams to harvest the water for the use in agriculture, and the industrialization of all of this, of cattle, of farming, of infrastructure, railroads, mining, right? At the cost of the landscape. There was an indifference to this world. And there is a story that one of our dear brothers, Mohadin Abdulazi, writes about the destruction of his community in Palestine. And every time I read that, I am moved in a painful way, in a tragic way, how the nation state of Israel went into this community and destroyed it totally, so that it totally disappeared. And this is what has happened at this border. I myself remember, as a young woman, standing by my barrio as I saw these steel balls bringing down every single adobe house, building, people that I had lived with, that we had all lived in the old barrio. And it was destroyed to the ground. It became a pile of dirt. And when I had to go to work, I would walk over that pile of dirt. All our gardens were gone because every house there had a garden. So I think that when we bring this together, we have to globalize what the presence is of this border so that it is not marginalized, it is not a side policy, but it is part of the, as important as anything, that we have to associate ourselves with the experience of Palestine. We have to associate ourselves with the places in Africa. We have to understand clearly the global aspect of this and to stop minimizing what is going on totally. And so I thank you for listening to this. I thank especially the Migrant Trail people who have heard this presentation many times. And I will continue to repeat it many times because I think it is so important and that this information is being banned, right? And so we have to fight against that. And we have to center in on celebrating our resistance, that we are here and we are not going anywhere. And so I thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Lupe. I will listen to that as many times as you want to say it. I don't think any of us get tired of learning our history. I learn something every time you talk.
There was one other thing I wanted to say before I leave, Kat, is that when Eddie mentioned Maria Jimenez, I would also like to mention another person that is two people that are very important to us, Jose Matos, who was with us in the first walk and now is in the spirit world. And also, Maria Jimenez, as well, and Roberto from California. I mean, those people are with us and we're foundational and I think we should remember them.
Thank you. Don't leave yet because we're going to do Q&A. Eric, can you also spotlight Eddie? So we will have, there are a few questions.
Eddie, if you could go ahead and turn on your camera. I can't spotlight until he turns on his camera. I've already asked him twice.
Okay, Eddie, turn on your camera. I can text him as well. Oh, there he is. Okay, so we have a few questions in the Q&A. The first one, I'm a bilingual psychologist and volunteer at Casalitas. I recently found out how many folks are getting lured into contacting outside attorneys to get legal assistance that ends up costing ridiculous amounts. I know that the Florence Project is real, yet inside the actual Florence facility, some unscrupulous attorneys have posted their info and lured some folks into paying for services and delivering nothing. What can be done to address this cruel form of entrapment? And has anyone run into attorneys who entrap folks in ICE detention settings? I would open that to any of you. I don't know if any of you have dealt with that or have had experience with that.
I mean, I think what I've seen in those cases where you have attorneys that are essentially see our communities as a piggy bank, right? As a place to enrich themselves, is that there are investigative units that AILA has, for instance, the American Immigration, I forgot what that, the association, legal association, that will follow up with any type of complaints regarding unscrupulous attorneys. So I would recommend contacting them, and especially if you have a specific case in mind that you can refer them to.
But what I would add to that is that is a reason why we started a while, actually around the time that DACA came into play, and actually before that, why we established the Keep Tucson Together. Is to provide for volunteer attorneys and for volunteers to become, to be trained enough to be able to do some of the paperwork for individuals, and also the initiative of the Justice for All campaign, which is to establish a public defender office funded by the county to Pima County to provide services for those families who cannot afford to present themselves for deportation in the courts. Because statistics show very clearly, you go without a lawyer, you're going to get deported.
I also, if you don't mind, Kat, real quick, I just want to mention that at 1 o'clock, we're going to have a panel on the legal and political realities along the border, and that might be a good question for that panel as well.
Yes. I also want to point out the Justice for All initiative is one of the organizations that registration fees are going to support this year. So, okay, another question is there a document regarding the border history? Is there, I've never heard of any one document, right? Lots of people have written.
There is no one document, but there recently have been, not recently, but in the last several years, there have been a flourish of very good books regarding the border. For me, still the basic book that I still use.
But there's a good number of resources there if you want to learn more about the border, if you want to listen more about the border. Podcasts have become a newer thing, but there's some really, really great content that is there. We also, from previous alternative migrant trails the last 2 years, as if you look at the content there was some suggested readings each day and podcasts each day. You could basically learn a ton just by reading and listening to what's covered on that. And some of our panelists later in the day will discuss some of the other things. I have a quick question for you both because, or for you three. It currently drives me completely insane to watch the news and coverage of, every time immigration is brought up. And it's even been brought into the recent, massacre in Uvalde, right? Because now the heroes there were the Border Patrol agents who had the tactical army and arms and equipment and all of these things. I'm wondering, what I see that meaning is that the militarization has become normalized even more. And I'm curious if you can share how you feel about the discourse around militarization, which is now bleeding into like militarizing our schools, right? How you feel about the discourse that's happening kind of across the board on a lot of these media outlets in regards to almost anything, but specifically when anything around immigration is brought up. So I'd love to ask if each of you wouldn't mind answering that question, or any of you who feel moved, or all of you who feel moved, what you think about that or thoughts on that.
Well, what drives me crazier is watching the political ads. And like, there's a woman running for governor in the state of Arizona, and her ads, she appears first with an AR-15 shooting, and then the border, and then she talks about how she will make it safe for everyone if she's elected to be governor, and she's the moderate candidate, right? The others are the Trumpsters. That's what drives me crazy, is to see those, and also the superficial discussions around immigration. Like I said before, they make it be like, oh, it's this little tiny sore that kind of bothers the United States here, somewhere among those people down there. Unimportant.
Thank you. Pedro or Eddie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, what I can share is that's, from my perspective, it's part of how narrative gets shaped, right, around border issues. And I can remember back when Anderson Cooper, when he was with CNN, arrived to the outskirts of Otay Mesa with a bulletproof jacket and a helmet, and making it seem as though our community was at war. And this was when there was increased violence taking place in Tijuana, and also in Ciudad Juarez, despite the fact that Ciudad Juarez and that El Paso and San Diego were the second and third safest cities, according to the FBI, of populations of over 500,000 people. But this narrative shifting oftentimes is done purposefully by the state. And it's part of, what you mentioned, the normalization of violence, which is an aspect of what the Pentagon used to use in their, low intensity conflict doctrine that has been written about back in the 90s. That later became part of the operations other than war, right? And so if you normalize the violence, you get to a point where people that are experiencing it stop questioning it. So you can have a Border Patrol agent that one day is handing out good citizenship certificates at the local elementary school, and then the next day that same agent might be cracking someone over the head with their baton, and it's seen as a normal way of life. And so our task has been, for a number of years, of trying to challenge that narrative, trying to present a much more realistic aspect of what militarization looks like in our communities, but also going even beyond that and describing how dynamic our communities are. The cultural aspects, what we learn from each other, the relationships that we build with our families in Mexico, the country, to show that the border in itself, as described as a third space by many people, in years past, that it's also a very dynamic area. But I also want to just highlight that more recently, CBP has been purposefully conducting these narrative operations in order to sway how incoming migrants, especially from the caravan, are seen. And one way that they've done that is by doing these operations, exercises along ports of entry, where they use collective punishment as a way to sway thinking that CBP has no other choice but to engage in these operations, violent operations, because the arrival of migrants might mean that they might have to then react violently. And so then it justifies the violence as a credible and a tolerable way to react, and as the only way to respond to people needing help. And it also shapes thought by suggesting that people that are waiting in the border to cross are now inconvenienced because of migrants who are coming in caravans. And so this is one way that it's done purposefully, and it's not an accidental type of framing around how narrative gets shaped around border issues.
Thank you.
Let me add to that. Here in the state of Texas, of course, the narratives on border issues are shaped by an enhanced police apparatus, police mechanisms that continue, from Rick Perry, bringing the National Guard down to the border, and then the governors increasing their border surge, and continuing that narrative, and in terms of protecting the border, the passage of SB 4 in Texas, in terms of allowing, local police to question people's immigration status, and then, of course, the use of secure communities to hold people in county jails for longer than allowed, in terms of enforcing the enforcement mechanisms that continue to permeate in the state of Texas. But I think it's epitomized right now by Operation Lone Star in Texas, in terms of Abbott, continuing, running for re-election and continuing the demagoguery and the hate that is really being set up in terms of enhancing criminal trespass charges on migrants, that so that involves, for one, it was a lot of the railroads were being involved in the beginning, but now a lot of the ranchers in a couple of the counties in around Del Rio and Ciudad Cunha, Maverick County, and some other, Kinney County are areas that are really, really, enhancing the criminal trespass charges of migrants. And that number is close to 10,000, if not more, already, people that are in state prisons. So that whole aspect continues, to enforce the whole militarization, enforcement mechanisms that we're dealing with right now. So, even Abbott was thinking that he could throw people in jail without. I mean, we know what takes place at the border with Title 42 in terms of no due process. And people just being thrown back, and then of course, as Pedro has mentioned, remain in Mexico, policy that was set up. All of that just continues to permeate in terms of what we're facing with in terms of a militarized border with the checkpoints. I called yesterday. I had a group of students that came in yesterday from Ohio. 18 students that have, the third time they had visited the center. And, the last time that they were here, that one student was asking Border Patrol regarding the use of force, and they just got all bent out of shape in terms of having to respond to a question like that, especially, where a young man gets shot across the border, in that aspect of it. So, having to deal with that in the state of Texas, I think just epitomizes the general tone and general election and the rhetoric and the demagoguery that exists in terms of continuing, to demonize and vilify all the migrants that are coming to the border. Operation Lodestar is a complete failure, just causing all kinds of chaos, but at the same time, we've got over 10,000 migrants that are in state prisons beyond what they face already. And once they get bonded out, and which is a role that the center is playing in terms of the public defenders reaching out to us and trying to facilitate delivery of bonds for people to get bonded out so that they can get deported is, it's what's going on down here at the border in Texas.
Great. We have another question that's come up. Can anyone address the ways these policies violate international laws regarding asylum seekers?
Well, I would say that every single practice that we have at the border is a total violation of every single international law. And not only that, it is just it is in just a violation of human rights. And that, as Pedro said and Eddie said, these are not accidental policies. These are intentional policies that are geared for a certain purpose. And I would add this, we have to remember that the border is open, absolutely open to the vast capitalist interests, corporations, and anybody who has wealth. The borders are established to control workers. And that is something that we have to, that we see in our centers, like all over.
Pedro, Eddie, would you like to comment at all?
So for people that are seeking asylum, there are the non-refoulement policies or conventions that obligate a state from sending people to a location where they will be facing harm. And both the migrant protection protocols and the Title 42 violate the non-refoulement principles because they explicitly are placing people in harm's way, and as well as violating federal law. Under the United States federal law, that the U.S. is obligated to take in people who have an expressed fear of returning to their home country. And it's also important to point out that the Mexican government plays a role in this as well. The debate about whether they should be taking people in as a third country arose with Trump and the threat that the U.S. government made then that they would tax the Mexican government on certain goods. And so, there's a lot of political back and forth that goes on here, but certainly the Mexican government is also complicit in the abusive practices that migrants are facing because of the U.S. sending people to Mexico to either wait for their hearings or simply because they're not respecting their right to make asylum claims.
Yeah, clearly over the last few years, the right for an asylum claim doesn't exist. There's no right under Title 42, and then the whole issue regarding the Remain in Mexico program. So yeah, I mean, again, there's the fact that there's Title 42 has completely expelled people, and then people don't even have the opportunity to express a credible fear and a refoulement, as Pedro is saying, in terms of returning to Mexico or being placed back in their own home country. So those issues are being violated on a daily basis, and I'm not surprised, that the Biden administration has not taken a more aggressive position regarding those due processes and asylum claims. This recent declaration in terms of a 30 to 45 days period of adjudicating asylum claims, I think is all very, very much of a sham and a both situation.
Thank you all for sharing your words and your wisdom. I always think of the thing about if you don't learn your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And I remember as a young woman moving to Arizona and never having heard about the deaths on the border, and never even hearing the word militarization before moving to Tucson. I remember being really shocked and outraged at all these things. And I remember Lupe looking at me and saying, "This is not new. This has been happening for years and years." And now, 20 years later, I feel like I say the same thing to new people coming to the border. And I think that's one of the things that at Migrant Trail, when we were putting this together, we wanted people to understand that the border has its stories, has its history, and can speak for itself rather than having political figures and political parties and elected people speaking for us. So I want to thank each of you for joining us today. Really, really appreciate taking the time. Folks, their bios are on the website if you are wanting to learn more about them. And we are going to take a break now for 15 minutes, and we will come back for our next panel. So thank you again.
Thank you, everybody. And then thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Guadalupe, Eddie, and Pedro, thank you so much. And Kat, thanks for moderating. We are going to take a 15-minute break, and so we'll be back at 45 minutes after the hour. And our next panel is Reality Check. What are the realities faced by migrants and immigrants today? We'll see you in a little bit.
Voy a cantarles, señores, todo lo que yo sufrí cuando dejé a mi patria.
Okay, I asked Eric to put all of the panelists up onto the screen at the start here, because you all are all amazing workers. in service every day to people on the border and in the interior of the U.S., immigrants and migrants who depend on your service for their very lives at times, and for their ability to live their lives and to stay with their families. I wanted to introduce you to each other at the start here. And because we are a community, you are important members of a community of service to migrants and immigrants. So first, Blake Gentry is an international policy expert in Indigenous community health and development, in Indigenous languages and transmigration, and climate change adaptation. He researches rights and advocates for policy change in legal immigration standards, immigration rights, and Indigenous language rights. He directs the Indigenous Language Office at the Alitas Shelter under AMA Consultants in Tucson. Perhaps you have all seen the NPR story a couple of days ago about Casa Alitas, or heard it. And you know, they were talking about 1,000 people a day starting to come in there, and the lack of resources that exist now, and that the impending loss of resources to support that from the pandemic funding, and then also the anticipated increase over that number of people that are coming through Casa Alitas every day, when and if, and we hope soon, the Title 42 travesty is lifted. So that work that Blake is doing is incredibly important, and to make resources and communication really possible for many of the people that have come through that speak Indigenous languages and do not speak English or Spanish. So secondly, Laura Peniche is a DACA recipient, as we call them, kind of unfelicitously, I think. She has been in the country from Mexico since she was a child, and her documentary film debut, No One Shall Be Called Illegal, premiered at the 2011 Denver International Stars Film Festival. In 2017, she co-produced the documentary film Five Dreamers, and which showed on Rocky Mountain PBS and the National Public Broadcasting System. She also works with Modus Theater as the project engagement manager for the launch of the Undocu America project, in which she still participates as a writer and performer. For many years, she's been an active advocate and community organizer for immigrant rights, and is currently a member of Together Colorado's Immigration Committee. That's an interfaith group, very active in this state, and of National Coalition Communities for Sheriff Accountability. She works full-time as the hotline manager for Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, and is supporting the coordinators team for the Colorado Rapid Response Network hotline. So then we have also with us is Gail Kokorik, who is a Tucson Samaritan for many years, and a migrant trail walker many years, and a member of Sala Visión for almost 2 years. She's the director of Sala Visión, and Gail and Dora Rodriguez started a migrant center in Sasabe, Sonora, just on the other side, where we come through every year. And they noticed that, you know, with more and more people being just dumped back over the border into this little cartel controlled town, and more coming up through their crossing, that there was no place for them to go. And so they just started it up. It just made it happen. And it's a beautiful little place that people can make phone calls and they can get some water and get out and get some shade. And it's a beautiful thing to do. And they're also, Gail and Dora are also vigilante fighters on the border, doing amazing work. Can't believe they do with these vigilantes that are kidnapping kids coming over the border and all of that. So like I said, for the rest of you, every day in service. And then Sister Lucy Nye is a school sister of Notre Dame. She is ministered for 12 years on the border, collaborating with agencies that support migrants in Agua Prieta, Sonora, and also shelters on the US side around Douglas. She originally is from Wisconsin. She served in education, youth retreat, ministry, hospital, chaplaincy, administration, as well as all of these, all of this service on the border. So I wanted you guys to know who each other were as we start, because all of your work is so essential and so important and so amazing. And so we'll start with Blake, who is with the Indigenous Languages Offices and works at Casa Alita. So Blake, go ahead. You have 15 minutes and we'll let you know when you're getting close to the end of that. And then there'll be a Q&A at the end. As I said, Gail will have a Q&A at the end in about a half an hour. Thank you, Blake.
Yeah,
You need to turn your
Blake,
mic
no,
on.
his mic's, he's been having some mic issues. He was saying a minute ago. So
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there we go. Now you're on.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, I was hoping to go second or third. I was trying to finish up something, but I will use what I've got, and I'll need to share
Well,
screen.
if you would like, we can switch you out.
If someone else could go first, that would be
Yeah.
great. Thank you. Sorry.
Laura, are you ready to go? Okay.
Yes, I am.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you so much, Tom. And I can see you, so I'll be looking at your fingers.
Okay.
First of all, I want to thank all the hosts of the Migrant Trail for doing this work. I am an immigrant here in Colorado I've been here for almost 25 years, and it's just shocking to me that some of this information I'm learning it for the first time. And that just tells me how crucial this work is and how important it is that we elevate our stories. As Tom mentioned, my name is Laura Peniche. I work as hotline manager with Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. And I migrated here. I've been thinking about my dad today all day because I crossed the border with my dad. I was only 13 years old. My little brothers were 10 and 6. And I remember my father carrying us through desert lands. And I remember us as a family crossing here, having so much faith, like in this country. We had faith that we would make it, we would be safe, and that we would have a better life. And it never crossed our minds at all that we would be in danger. Maybe this is something that my father knew, I don't know, but he didn't relate that fear to us. He took very good care of us. And I also remember an experience while we were crossing where we were being spotlighted by a helicopter that was right above our heads and spotting that light on us, and we ran to kind of hide inside, like in a bush. And at this point, my father offered a prayer and pretty much said, God, our lives are in your hands, and we will, we will let your will take place. And I always remember this moment because actually the Border Patrol agents that were on a helicopter above our heads, they never came back to search us. We were just hiding under the bush, and we waited there for hours. And yeah, thank God those agents never came and looked for us. We were able to make it here to our destination. And I am very aware that my story is very unique in a way that we were able to cross without harm and without losing our lives or anybody in our family. I lived here in Colorado undocumented for almost 15 years before I was able to receive DACA. And so as part of that experience in Colorado, my childhood was very secluded. I just didn't want to tell anybody of my experience, of my status. I remember being in fear because it felt like Colorado can feel like a border town at times. I live in Aurora, Colorado, which is very close to the towns in the southern Colorado region, where going there can be triggering because there's history in these lands of Black and brown people who have been lynched in these areas and in masses. I live 15 minutes away from another town called Stapleton. It's a small city, and it's called Stapleton after a white supremacist leader who was openly a member of the KKK in Denver, but he was also serving in our state government. And so this history is still very much alive. The town of Stapleton was considering a few years ago changing the name so that they could remove the name of this white supremacist who caused so much harm in Colorado. But the people actually in the town of Stapleton, they refuted that, and they decided and voted to keep their name. And so there's everywhere I go in Colorado, there's things that can trigger you as an immigrant or as a person of color. And I can say that I am so glad that we have organizations and movements that are attending to the cause of immigrants and the cause of Indigenous people and Black people, because I personally, my family and I suffered many things, abuses, injustices, because we lacked a legal status. And I'm glad that now there's more resistance to this and more help for people who need help. I also want to name that after living here for more than 20 years, undocumented, my father passed away about a year ago now. He passed away from cancer, and it's important to name that our fathers are dying here undocumented, and they're dying because they have a lack of access to healthcare and to other services that are so needed. My father was so ill, and it took him about a year of living with pain to be able to just get a diagnosis on his cancer. And then after his diagnosis, it took about another year for us to be able to find treatment for him, for his cancer. So at the time, by the time he was able to receive the treatment, it was too late. And this is a reality that many of our parents are facing right now. And so as a person with DACA, I also have to live with the anxiety of not knowing what's going to happen to DACA, which is about to be decided in about a month or two at the Supreme Court. And that's a reality. I may not be able to keep DACA and lose my work permit and lose my ability to stay here in Colorado with my children. So all of this to say that it is an honor to be here and also to be doing the work with the hotline. In Colorado, we have the Colorado Rapid Response Network hotline, where people can report active ICE raids, and they can also document ICE incidents. And this hotline was established in 2017 after the threats that we were receiving by the administration of massive raids. And so it is a community effort that has been so helpful to be able to respond to raids that are happening at the moment, but also to know what's happening, to keep account of all the people who are being snatched away from our communities, and also to keep accounts and testimonies that need accountability by law enforcement agencies. Through this hotline, we've been able to see different trends. I can speak to the ones right now under the Biden administration because as an immigrant myself, I was very hopeful that we would see better things this year. And it's been sad to see that ICE is relentless, continuing to separate families. I keep confidentiality of the testimonies that are related to me, but I can speak to the trends, like seeing people who still need to be locked inside their houses for days and weeks because ICE is outside of their house, just waiting for them to be targeted. And these are parents that are being targeted. We are receiving many calls from people at the border who, because of Title 42, have been separated from their children. And we see cases where the parents get deported right away, but the children are being held back for longer. And the parents are having such a hard time just trying to locate the children, try to see if they're okay or not. And of course, it's terrible to see that people are being denied the right to seek asylum and being sent back to the deadly conditions that they're escaping. I can also say that CERC recently released a report. We've been doing research on how ICE is targeting our communities, because here in Colorado, we have passed legislation to break the ties between police enforcement and ICE enforcement. And so it is very, it was very triggering to see that a lot of people are still being picked up. And so we wanted to know why or how is this happening? People call and say, how did ICE find me? Like, there's no way that they should have tracked me. And so it was important to do this research, and I will share the report here shortly in the chat. But this report is telling us, and we found evidence that ICE has access to the database that police uses. And so even though we've passed legislation, ICE has still found, is not only finding ways to work around sanctuary policies, but they're also building an infrastructure of surveillance. and keeping data and tracking all immigrants so they can be targeted for deportation. So this is very alarming, especially because I am seeing leaders who are speaking out on this and being picked up by ICE and being targeted for their activism, which is something that shouldn't be happening, according to the latest memo on prosecutorial discretion from ICE. Let's see, there's so much to say. I don't know about how many minutes I have left, but I can say
one or two.
Oh, thank you, Tom. Yes, I can say that just I wish I could say, things are getting better. Things are looking like they're getting better, but it's very scary what I'm seeing. And I'm sorry that I don't have better news on how things are looking. But that doesn't mean that we're gonna stop fighting. I am a person of faith, and I will continue to expect things to get harder, maybe. But we're never gonna stop fighting. This is my home. My ancestors have been traveling through these lands back and forth for hundreds and hundreds of years. I also have ancestors who fled Europe to come here and find a better place and a safe place to live. And so this administration and the people in this country need to know that this is our home and that we are here to stay and we're not going anywhere. We're going to keep fighting for human rights for everyone. And I hope that we can approach this work with a sense of healing for ourselves and for the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you for all you do every day. How about Blake? Are you ready yet? Blake?
Yeah, just a second.
Okay.
Yeah, let me get the share screen. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Laura for describing both the apparatus, which continues to deny her and many other DACA students' rights, but also the larger societal issues of how and why this can continue. We know that under Obama, the G-287 agreements were established, and they deliberately targeted Latino communities in the border. So the idea of selective enforcement or targeted enforcement is something that we should understand is easily washed over by the use of technology and hiding behind technology to try to legitimize practices of repression against immigrants and denial of their rights. So I'm going to look a little bit at some technical issues of how human rights are reported in the borderlands and some of the problems that we have with it and why it matters. First off, I want to talk about counting, and I'm going to use Indigenous as an example of this and then get to draw to a larger conclusion at the end. But first of all, my office has been involved with the issue of trying to count Indigenous peoples who come through the border. Last year, at this very event, I presented information and data showing Indigenous peoples between 2017 and 19 by our count through the Elitas intake process that 1 out of 5 or 20% were Indigenous language speaking people as their first or primary language. Also, that's been validated now by Americans for Immigrant Justice out of Miami, who have many cases of undocumented unaccompanied youth. And on their caseload, they also did a analysis, and they also showed that 20% of their caseload showed they were Indigenous children who spoke an Indigenous language as a primary language. So we now no longer have a mystery about this issue. It's an issue that continues, and the lack of any institutional counting continues on many different planes. So I'm going to go through this and say and explain and try to illustrate how and why this matters. So the principal issue for indigenous peoples is not an individual counting of them, though you have to count individuals if you're going to end up counting societies and nations. And the reality is that there is international law that's been established, and that took a long time to happen over many, many years and in different institutions, including before there was a UN and the International Labour Organization, and then in UN and also in the OAS. And the issue that we have, though, is that that international law is not embedded nor enforced within US domestic law, nor is it embedded or enforced in other laws of other countries of Latin America, and not just Latin America, but now also globally, as immigration rises, as the failure of the neoliberal states to solve the problems which they promised us they would solve with free trade, we continue to pile up extreme examples of discrimination based on the origins of different peoples. So one of the issues that has happened for indigenous is there's been a decoupling of the international legal definitions of who are indigenous peoples, which is called for in conventions for the rights of folks. Individually, it's called for in the ICERD, which is probably the most well-used UN convention. It's the Convention on Civil and Political Rights. The DRIP is the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the UN in the year of 2007. The American Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which happened through the OAS, which is a very well-constructed convention, which is enforceable in the US because the US is a signatory to the OAS. The DRIP, the one I mentioned before, doesn't have legal status in terms of being able to go to the UN and enforce it, but the DRIP does, and so does ILO. The US is not a signatory to ILO, but most of the countries of Latin America are. So in terms of what this means is that if you're going to count people as a nation, you have to be able to count them as individuals, or you don't know that their nation is arriving. So indigenous peoples are defined differently than other minorities because they had status, which was a nation status at the time of the arrival of Europeans. And in international law, they are still considered a society and people separate from other societies and peoples. In international law, they're not called minorities, they're not called ethnicities, and they're not called peoples with indigeneity. They have a legal framework which recognizes them, and this is very solid. The issue arrives when folks come to the US border, and there is no recognition of that in the operational work of the Department of Homeland Security agencies, including ICE, CBP, Customs Border Patrol, and Border Patrol. So what happens then is we have a decoupling of the reality of international law versus the US practice. And this practice is reinforced by the social norms of most institutions that go beyond just the Border Patrol. These are also prevalent in the non-governmental organizations and those who say they represent immigrant peoples, and the NGOs and in the media. Now, there are exceptions. Some organizations have made efforts to move beyond this and to recognize indigenous peoples, and therefore indigenous peoples get counted. Normally, they're only counted as individuals, and they're all put into a smorgasbord of a category called indigenous, or like we often called in the United States. I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation. We have over 400,000 members, but we're called Native Americans. Our status is erased in the terms of how people understand, and they don't understand because they haven't had the education to let them know about the treaties that exist, at least in the framework of US domestic law, as one example. So one of the things that's happened recently, which has been an advance in terms of human rights reporting, is Human Rights First. Human Rights First has been putting out aggregated reports of human rights violation in the borderlands, and they've been able to show in a very widespread manner the extreme forms and the depth of the violence that's been unleashed in northern Mexico border towns by various cartels under the policies of MPP and Title 42, which do not allow Central Americans into the country and do not allow Mexicans into the country, except for a few cases. So categorically, they are being denied the right to asylum, which is not denied to Venezuelans, Cubans, Brazilians, Haitians, and others, even though some of the Haitians were deported, half of them weren't deported. So this is a categorical use of the asylum law, which was not the way that it was set up. So we have a very tricky situation going on in the jujitsu of the use of asylum, which was set up at the end of World War II, when there were millions of people who were displaced peoples, and they needed to have the right to enter another country and to be in that country and to gain a legal status, because in the immediate aftermath of World War II, many of them could not and would not return to their home countries for obvious reasons. So that architecture has now pretty much collapsed. And the United States has been using asylum from time to time for the last 3 decades in a very political way to pick the countries that they want to allow people to come through and people who they don't want to come through, and they have to twist in the wind the definitions of asylum in order to get that. And now we see it in a very widespread area. So there has been human rights reporting in a very aggregated way from various sources sent to Human Rights First, and they have done a series of reports. The Indigenous Languages Office started looking at them in October. We started tracking the 2,044 cases of violence, and we counted 20 types of violence that were being carried out. We started doing an analysis of that. By December, when we contacted the authors, we understood that now the count wasn't 2,044, it was over 8,000 cases of violence. So what we've been doing since then is trying to analyze with some precision those counts of violence. And I'm going to show you why that's difficult, and then I'm going to describe why it matters. So when you aggregate data, if you set up your data collection in a way that doesn't distinguish gender, doesn't distinguish specifically race or other such categories, then when you aggregate it in the end, you can't tell how many people have been affected by the violence. So the argument in favor of the practice that they're doing is that, well, we have such a huge scale of violence, it should be very clear to everybody that this is going on and it's going on to everybody. And I don't disagree with that. The problem then later is when you want to argue legally in court or through bureaucratic procedures for the rights of specific vulnerable groups, you can't do it because the data isn't there. Here is a disaggregation of data. I'm going to show you what the aggregation looks like in a second, but this is the disaggregation, which took us months and months to do. We did this by word searches through the 8,000 cases that were presented, and we had to not use those which would put together different categories of violence. And there's a reason why the ones at the top are in red and the other ones are in blue, and I will get back to that at the end. I don't know if everybody can see the slide at the bottom. I can't, but there's a total down there in 956 for the blue box, and then over 5,000 for the red box. This is what the database looks like when you're looking at Human Rights First database. And I would say to their credit, they have made their database available to the public. We got it in Excel, it's published in Word, but with Excel, you can do a lot of work. So you'll see on the left-hand side, there's a column here and it says rape, sexual assault, kidnapping, human trafficking, armed robbery, and beatings. And on the right, you will see a pretty decent narrative description of what this is, right? It's targeting that these are all happening under Title 42, which is the policy question. And it's saying some of the countries that people come from. But once you read that, then we don't know how many people from what country were affected by which type of violence. And what this report will do in the end, the report that we are going to publish, and the one that we've had a lot of cooperation from the shelters who operate in the Mexican border area, Casa Esperanza and Sasabe is one. There are others, some who could not reveal their names and need to remain anonymous, etc. So we have qualitative interviews from those places, which we will be comparing to some of the quantitative information that we have here. So you can see here the issue. If you look through the whole database, you would see this number over here. And there are over 6,290 accounts where we have multiple variables listed. So we can't disaggregate them because they're just reported out of 679 people had one or all of these things happen to them. So in terms of academic or human rights reporting, this is a technical issue, but it also gets to a definitional issue. Now, here we see one category of violence, and this is kidnapping. And I just picked this randomly. This is a family, and RMX means remain in Mexico, which is the same as MPP. And here's the description of what happened to a particular family who also, because of MPP, were not allowed in, and you can read the horrendous things that happened to them as a result of this, right? Including kidnapping a second time. And I chose, I said randomly, but I came upon this and I said, well, this would be a good example for the category of kidnapping, because after we disaggregated data, we came up with 2,346 kidnapping accounts. Now, the kidnapping accounts also don't tell us whether or not necessarily within the narrative they were extorted at the same time. The assumption is almost all of them were, or almost all of them were, because the reason that kidnapping occurs is so that they can be extorted. So now what I'm going to do is talk about, what does this mean? When you want to understand how vulnerable groups are targeted, or even whether they're represented in the larger data, if you don't have the intake done with that data when it comes in, then you can't talk about it when it comes out. This is the problem with organizations that work with immigrants, but don't ask people their background. Last year, I presented information and talked about stigma. Why is stigma a problem? It's a problem for the reason that people who identify themselves different than the general population are afraid that they're going to be further damaged or abused, because if they identify themselves openly, that can be the case. So through that sympathy, oftentimes immigrant organizations and the government and others, people who are sympathetic, don't do anything different than the government that is trying to just only report aggregate numbers without identification of vulnerable peoples. There was some progress made under the Obama administration, especially for LGBTQ in detention, because at least there was a protocol put in place for that. Whether or not that is helpful, we would have to talk to that community to understand what the results are. And that's why certain types of studies are very helpful. What this is in the large picture from an indigenous point of view is the same kind of colonial practices that have been used forever against indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples are recognized collectively when they want the resources that indigenous peoples have some dominion over, and then we're not recognized collectively only on an individual basis, when it would actually mean that we would be able to claw back more legal status and more rights. And so we're used to this game of aggregation and disaggregation by the US government. But what has happened here is that the asylum system itself is now collapsed, because countries are being chosen solely on the basis of the administration's desire to have a relationship with those countries, or to not have a, thanks Tom, not have a relationship with those countries. And so those practices, which Native Americans and indigenous in general have been used to for a very long time, have now been applied carte blanche to the whole border. And this administration and the previous one, the Trump administration, are getting away with it because people in the United States don't understand asylum law, and they don't understand international law. So we have seen now the collapse, and I titled this, excuse me, I titled this talk as a collapse of the asylum system, but it applies to areas beyond these borderlands, because this collapse of the asylum system is also happening on a global scale. As countries get away with picking and choosing who they will and won't allow to apply for asylum, that doesn't mean that they've decided individually whether or not they have the right to or the merits for an asylum case. That's a second issue, but whether or not they even have a right to apply for it. So the international law is now collapsed. It was set up in 1954. In 67, there was an amendment in US law. It's called the 1980 Refugee Act. That's also been thrown aside. The Congress is completely ignoring it. The Supreme Court will surely ignore it, and the administration, this one and the last one, have also ignored that. So I want to go back now to this. And the reason is because I think we need to call a spade a spade. And what we see here is this is the result of the neoliberal states and the way in which human rights have now been treated as another commodity that can just be reported out, and they can shift the blame to other sources. And I want to point us to one particular fact. This country has recently gone through a myriad of public massacres by people who get hold of arms. Those arms are bought legally in the United States through various nefarious means. However, those same arms are now, and have been for the last few decades, finding their way across the border, and they have armed cartels. So we now have a direct link between domestic violence called domestic terrorism in the United States and the kind of terrorism that is being carried out with the full knowledge of the US government and the Mexican government in Mexico by cartels. And there is plenty of evidence, and not enough time here to show the collusion between the states and these cartels, but these are the results. Our analysis shows the following, and this is my last point, that the activities in red show what is useful for cartels to make money with. This is literally how they make their money. This is the use of this violence. It is not random violence. It doesn't fall from the sky. It's not in reaction to just racism. It is useful for them making money, and they are making an unbelievable amount of money. And then we have all of these other things down here. We could say that shootings, for example, should go up to this category. That would add 15. We could say that murder should go up there. But what all of these are under the neoliberal framework are the establishment and the control of the marketplace. I think it's going to be more useful for us to understand the borderlands, as Todd Miller has done in terms of the border militarization industry, to understand that smuggling, both human smuggling and narcotic smuggling, is part of a multinational business model. It works in tandem and parallel with state entities, the United States government and the Mexican government, and it's only possible because of the neoliberal states. And what I mean by that is the loose and light regulation of narcotics moving through on commercial trucks, through the borderland, through the ports of entry officially, and at the same time, in the exact same places, the repression of migrants who are being displaced by the very policies of the neoliberal states, who have pumped up agro exports and drug smuggling instead of development in the very countries where it needs to take place, so people don't have to leave in the first place. So that's the end of my presentation. And what I would say is there are solutions, and that begins with the organizations who work with migrants and immigrants to have ways and methods in place to count LGBTQ as one example and Indigenous as another of vulnerable groups. And there are more than that. So at this, I will leave, and thank you all very much.
Thank you, Blake, for that beautiful presentation. Very clear. Gail Kukurik with the Casa de la Esperanza in Sasabe, Sonora. Gail, thank you for being here.
Okay, we lost our connection on the computer, so I had to switch over to the phone. So can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. So you'll have to, since I don't have a clock now, let me know, wave. Okay, somebody's going to let me know in 15 minutes is up. Okay, so in September of 2020, Dora Rodriguez and Sister Judy and I made a trip into Sasabe, Sonora. Out of curiosity, I hadn't been there in a long time. And we discovered that there was a tremendous amount of people being deported there, upwards of 150 people a day, into a community that has no resources. There's no services at all there. It's 135 kilometers to the first town that has a gas station or a bus station, which is Altar. So there's no bank, there's no post office. There is a school, there's a few small stores, there's some churches, but it's basically an island. So they were getting up to 150 people a day deported to a place that could not handle it, with a population of about 2,000 people. It was just, it was unbelievable. And we talked to Grupo Veda, and they said, can you help us? And so Dora and Sister Judy and I put our heads together, and we discovered that we could help. And we started putting the word out to all the people that we knew, journalists, that let people know that there was a real problem. And we needed to feed people and get water to them. The first article that went out was an intercept. We ended up with an article on the front page of the New York Times in December. And in the meantime, we were taking 700 meals a week to the border to feed to the people that were being deported 24 hours a day. So Dora and I thought, what we needed was a community/migrant center. So we started looking into it. And May 1st, a year ago, we had the grand opening of Casa de la Esperanza. And we were getting not as many people deported because when all these newspaper articles came out, the government realized that they were doing something that they weren't supposed to be doing. And they started deporting people to Douglas, Agrippeta, and Nogales. And Sister Judy and Lucy can tell you what happened there. They suddenly had all of these tremendous amount of people coming through. And then they were going to Nogales too. So suddenly we were going to Sassabee, we were getting up early in the morning and driving down to be at the border at 7 in the morning down in Douglas. Things started to average out a little bit. They kept consistent getting people, their times changed. Our port started dropping to 10 to 40 a day, which is more realistic for a small community. So we stayed consistent with that. Then we decided, because we were a community center, that we should work with the community. So we started some projects to help people there because there's like not much going on. It's like I said, pretty much an island there. So we started the embroidery group, and we have 20, 25 women that meet every Wednesday that come into the center to have coffee and socialize and to do embroidery work. So this is a sample. I use this one. It's beautiful work. And what's the wonderful thing about it is that we're able to pay the women $20 per piece. So they're actually getting, it's helping the community, helping families. And I know there's a lot of pride involved in that. So we also, besides helping the community, we have food, we have clothing, we have a shower. So people could come from the community if they need any of those things, any of that kind of help. We also, right now, they've stopped deporting people into the community, but we still have people that are traveling north. So we're getting those people as they go north. And we try to give, this time of the year especially, we got these from Mark and Susie Sanders from Green Valley. And I think the bag was made down in Agrippeta. And it's a life straw, and it tells them in Spanish how to use it. So this, we know they save lives. They're a wonderful thing to have. I know our women love giving these to people because they say, you could put it around your neck and you've got your straw with you. So it's a great thing to be able to offer somebody, especially now when it's so hot and people are going into a very dry season. We're hoping to have a decent monsoon. We had a very dry winter, and right now the cattle tanks are drying up terribly, and they're already starting to find. They're also starting to find bodies. So it's just a real tragedy. So Casa Esperanza is helping people, like I said, right now in the community and people that are heading north. We also have let one of our women open up a little hot dog stand on the porch, and she hires people to work with her. So she's able to make a little living. So any way that we could help the community and help people there. We also will help send people home. So we have some people from Guatemala, and they said, I can't do it again. It's too hot, it's too hard. I didn't know it was gonna be this dangerous. I wanna go home. Well, Dora and I have figured out a way to raise some money, and we pay a local person to drive them to Altar, to the Catholic shelter there. And at the shelter, they take them to the bus station, and we pick up the tab, and we pay for them to get back to the border of Guatemala. So it costs us a lot to keep the operation going, but our big goal is to try to help people and help them stay home if that's what they choose. We also I have on a bracelet. This is for Ukraine, yellow and blue. We have a young man who's in Guatemala who makes the bracelets, and we pay him. So he aged out in the system here, got deported, and Dora stayed in touch with him, and we have him making the bracelets, and we pay him. So we have people in Guatemala. We did have somebody in Honduras. I think in El Salvador, we have people working in Sasabe with the little cottage industries to help people make a living and help them be able to stay in their own community. So Dora is right now in El Salvador, and she is trying to get closer to the airport because she's flying out tomorrow. She really regrets that she can't be here today. She really wanted to. She planned on being here. She is the director of Celevision, and I'm in charge of volunteers with that organization. But we work with the sister organizations to run the Sasabe Center. So we always say that we don't have a director there, we have a committee. We work it as a team. So we have women that work there for a stipend, and we're able to keep them going. And then we make decisions as a committee. How much am I doing time-wise?
2 minutes, Gail.
More minutes. Oh my gosh, we're doing great.
2 minutes, please.
I can't hear you.
2 minutes, please.
2 minutes. Okay. Right now, we're going there this afternoon to, we're having the new electrical put in the building to make it safer for our community. We're just trying to keep things running. Like I said, we're strictly run on donations, and anybody's always welcome. Everybody in the community is welcome. We work closely with Blake. If we have somebody, especially an Indigenous person that's been abused, we make a report and we turn it into Blake Gentry. Thank God we haven't had too many of those. We do have Tono Autumn people in the vicinity. They're always welcome. I don't know how many times I've gone through the village and said, you're always welcome here. Oh, we also have a health clinic, and we run the health clinic once a month, at least once a month. We do have nurses volunteer that go down in between the actual clinic, where we have doctors show up, and everybody, if you walk in that door, will help you. We've even made house calls. So it's free. We pick up the tab for any of the prescriptions that need to be filled. And so we're trying, like I said, not just to be a community center, but an immigrants and community center. So I hope that answers questions, and thank you for letting us be part of the program.
Thank you, Gail. And I hope in our Q&A, you can tell us a little bit about what you're doing. Getting chased by vigilantes on the border in the middle of the night.
Yeah, what time is the Q&A?
That's going to be in 15 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. So, Sister Lucy.
Yes, hello. Thank you
Hi.
for this opportunity. It's good to be here, even if we are virtual. My screen background is the Agua Prieta side of the border wall here, where beautiful murals are painted instead of the ugly, rusty US side. So that's what's behind me. Since pictures help to hear better, I have a PowerPoint to share, and I'm going to be reading my presentation. So here we go. And this is all in my way here. Let me get this out of the way so I can start my PowerPoint. Get it out of the way. Oops, it went way down to another place. Sorry. I'm going to stop this and get back to my beginning PowerPoint here. Nope. I don't know why it wants to keep starting where I am not am. That's the problem with these things sometimes.
No problem, sister.
No. I know.
Sister Lucy,
Sister
I
Judy,
wanna
go,
hear
go
from
ahead
the-
and
From the very beginning. That's what
beginning.
it says. Okay. From the beginning. But
hold
now
on.
you
Go ahead.
can't- Now you
There you
can't
go.
see it. I got to start again. Okay.
Go ahead and
There.
share again.
From the beginning. Here we go.
And then click where it says School Sisters. Click on your first frame first, your first slide. Go ahead and click on that just once. There you go. Now play from beginning. There you go.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So here we go. We are the School Sisters of Notre Dame that came to Douglas in the year 2010. There used to be 3 or 4 of us, but now 12 years later, here we are, just Sister Judy and I, this picture taken at one of the in-person recent migrant trails. I can't help but begin by connecting with the present mood of our country and world. I, like I'm sure so many of you, have felt weighted down and heavy with sadness these past weeks. So much unrest is swirling around the airwaves and social media waves. Images of the grinding war in the Ukraine burden our psyches. Relentless violence plagues our country and plays out in our everyday environments. It all feels too heavy to bear, but it is today's reality, and it's hard to sugarcoat it. The situation at the border is also grimly painful, but my presentation will hopefully show you some hope sprinkled throughout. In 2004, we learned earlier, 18 years ago, concerned border advocates deeply felt the tragedy of migrant deaths in the desert. They organized what today is still being called and run as the Migrant Trail. We walk for life. 18 years later, our immigration policies have only grown more cruel and the number of deaths has increased. So where is the outrage? We lament the daily murders that fill the front pages of our news. The names of victims and offenders are writ large, but there is no outrage for the 4,000 known migrant deaths over the past 20 years. And 4,000 is just the deaths in southern Arizona. And we always add that there are probably at least 4 times that number, since the desert is so good at destroying and scattering the evidence of death in a matter of days. Their names have not appeared in headlines or news announcements. So did their lives not matter? Their dying went unnoticed. The cause of death, hyper or hypothermia, really it was the elements, hunger, thirst. But what about the underlying deeper and political causes of death? Is anything being done about this? I gotta get rid of this. 2 days after the gun violence in Uvalde, Texas last week, a group of us traveled to the foothills of the majestic Chiricahua Mountains. We tried to imagine how long that journey took for Silvestra Garcia Espino Barrios, because it took us only it took us already an hour and a half by car. She was found there on February 6th, just 4 months ago. We were there to plant a cross in her honor and to pray for her family. Just think about the stamina it took to endure the walking and the cold February nights. At age 31, she was most surely a mother, perhaps trying to reach children who were already in the United States. Was she alone? Was she left behind by a group? How many days had she walked? Was she injured? What was her last communication with a loved one? For she was part of a family. She was a daughter, perhaps a sister, surely a cousin, a friend. Do I bear any responsibility in her death? Does our failure to reform immigration policies and laws by electing senators and representatives who stalemate any movement toward change, immigration reform, does this not implicate me, us, in her death and the death of another 4,000? Humane Borders is the organization that has mapped and recorded the details of migrant deaths in southern Arizona since 2000. Their interactive map allows you to find and see the exact location where remains are found. The remains, all artifacts, and any information that is known about them is kept at the morgue in Tucson. So you see on this chart that on the map you can find at their website, you put in the year of the death, our county, Cochise, and when you click on that dot where she was found, you'll get more detail. Age 31, exposure to the elements. Here she is, and there's a long line with everything else that you can find out about Silvestra. 20 years of records indicate nearly 400 deaths in our county of Cochise. Note the number of deaths beginning in 2012, before the pandemic closed the border, and since the practice of Title 42, which is continuing, of course. See how in 2020, the deaths increased to 20, 18 in 2021. And so far, not even half of 2022, and we've had 10 deaths. And this increase is the same all along the Arizona border. You may have heard about Griselda Verduzco Armenta. She was found on April 12th, 2 months ago, hanging upside down on the wall, 10 miles west of Douglas. Evidently, something of the harness apparatus got caught. This terrible event was hardly spoken about by news agencies, just a small article and then forgotten. Here is the famous red dot map with Cochise County noted. The practice of putting a memorial cross at the red dot locations of migrants was begun by Alvaro Enciso in 2014. He focuses on the desert south and west of Tucson. By doing a web search, you can find many videos and interviews if you want to learn more about Alvaro. In the spring of 2015, he came and spoke to a group of us. We planted a cross that day, and we resolved to begin our own practice of remembering the migrants by planting a cross. We had already been practicing a different kind of remembrance of deceased migrants in our weekly Healing Our Border Vigil. Every Tuesday since December of 2000, residents and visitors gather here in Douglas for a public prayerful procession of 5 blocks toward the border, calling out the names of migrants who died in Cochise County and placing a cross with their name along the sidewalk curb. With the pandemic, this vigil went virtual, and now we have a hybrid version with a group of us gathered and processing down the main street in Douglas to the border, along with folks on Zoom in New York, Guatemala, and wherever. Both groups calling out names until we arrive near the port of entry to Mexico, circle up, pray, sing, and then turn back, pick up the crosses from the curb, leaving no one behind. We have a website, crossplanting.wordpress.com, and it holds the history of all of our cross plantings. We have planted up to 150 crosses, and it has always been a team effort, lots of people involved. There are a couple of videos on the website, and we don't have time to watch them here, but maybe later in the question and answers, we might have time to view one of them. But I'll put the links in the chat at the end. Our crosses simply hold a name and a date, each an individual story. Some are planted along the highways that I frequently travel. So I look for them along the way, imagining the surrounding desert filled with many spirits. When I travel north on 191 past the coal-powered electric plant, I watch for 5 crosses, brothers and cousins, who were discovered in a coal car as it was being emptied. Along the San Pedro River, a familiar pathway for migrants moving north, there's Jimena, 8 months pregnant. The mothers who were present at that cross planting, pondering their own pregnancies, found this so difficult to imagine. In 2016, we remembered Rogelio. I'm going to try to move this thing here. Rogelio Nieves Baca. A couple years later, Sister Judy got a call from Rogelio's brother in California. Every once in a while, he reported, I do a web search with Rogelio's name to see if anything comes up, for we've lost contact with him 10 years ago. So I was surprised and happy when I discovered his name on a cross on your website. How does one who lives here not lose hope and turn to despair? Trying to get this to move. Come on. There we go. 16-year-old was bit by a snake last October. He did not receive the prompt response of our emergency personnel, for the 911 operator asked, "Is this a migrant?" No EMTs were sent, and Border Patrol came too late for Juan Diego. Last week, we heard of a migrant who was brought by Border Patrol to our Douglas emergency room. The man reportedly escaped from the hospital then and moments later died on the street as a result of a Border Patrol agent's, quote, use of force. And this is just 3 months after another incident, this time 31 miles east of Douglas, out in rugged mountainous desert terrain, that unarmed 31-year-old Carmelo Cruz was shot multiple times by a Border Patrol agent in a nighttime scuffle. We do find hope in the companionship of so many wonderful, hardworking border advocates with whom we collaborate. Their dedication is inspiring. We are lifted up each time we introduce them to those who come to visit for an educational border immersion. This is a way that we former teachers continue our ministry of education. Many of you may know the Tucson, Green Valley, and Ajo Samaritans and their life-saving work of putting water in the desert. When you walk in the vast desert, it seems like such a miracle, like finding a needle in a haystack, but we've often been told by deported migrants that they have indeed found those gallons of water. Sister Judy considers this one of the most important ministries she does. A couple of weeks ago in the mountains out of Ajo, Samaritans actually happened upon a group of migrants who were camped out at a water drop. What a gratifying surprise for Judy and those carrying water. It was a first. But doing something to help save lives and doing it with others gives one energy. As a volunteer at the Migrant Center in Agua Prieta, I was privileged to be with families and individuals who, before the pandemic, waited for their turn to approach the port of entry and ask for asylum. I helped them fill out asylum application forms, as well as practice math with US money and learn some English. For weeks on end, 50 men, women, and children slept in the bunk beds within one single room. It was definitely not easy. But I saw the kids and the adults of different families from different cultures care for each other in the tight space of the church patio. I remember Mui. Here he is in the middle there, the tallest one. I remember the day that he asked me if I could give him a pair of chanclas. I didn't know what he meant. And then I saw his bare feet, of course, flip-flops. And what a thrill to see Mui and his 7 other brothers and sisters in Casalitas. And they were ready to leave and go to Alabama. Yoseline, 17 years old on the far left, was sent to a facility for unaccompanied minors along with her 3 younger siblings. And after a month, traveled to be with their mother in Tennessee. She's since graduated from high school. And here we're learning to make empanadas at Christmas time. At times through WhatsApp, I hear from this couple now in New York, Haylor and Yudi from Cuba, who walked through the jungle between Panama and Colombia before arriving at the shelter. They were sent to detention in one of Eloy's private prisons. There, Judy and I were part of a team privileged to visit with detainees. Just our listening presence brought them those detainees encouragement. So when COVID stopped our detention visits, they wrote us letters about the terrible conditions they endured because of COVID restrictions. Elaine, now united with her US husband in New Jersey, spent almost a year in detention fighting for her asylum. So many beautiful people we've been privileged to encounter. Each person's story is unique and sacred. 100 to 200 deported migrants continue to be served almost every day at the Migrant Center, the Centro de Recursos para Migrantes, right at the border inside Agua Prieta. Gail, you talked about our migrants getting transferred from the Sasabe area over to Agua Prieta. As volunteers there, we can look into the eyes of the migrants and see a mix of so many emotions as they connect by phone with their family. One can hear their pain and recounting their failed attempt to reach their northern destination, but also share some relief that they are alive. Because of COVID's Title 42, many of these migrants try numerous times, 3 to 10 or more times. They try to evade arrest, but too often find themselves back in Mexico. Often frustrated and sometimes devastated by injury, the trauma of discovering and passing deceased migrants along the trail, yet these migrants have a resilience, love, faith, and insurmountable hope. Then after all they've been through on their trail walk, they walk out of the center. They are always leaving behind a sincere muchas gracias. And sometimes they even offer to sweep the area or do something in some way to help. Many migrants have walked more than 4 days and arrive with blisters and cactus spines. We do the best we can to help. It has been a privilege to volunteer here, both heartbreaking and heart strengthening.
Sister, can we move to the Q&A period now?
I have one just story to end.
All right.
One of the stories that Judy tells is about two friends who sat side by side inside the migrant center soaking their blistered feet. She and Sister Maribel witnessed this conversation. "Why didn't you just leave me there to die?" One was reprimanding the other. "All I wanted to do was die. I was so tired. Why didn't you leave me in the mountains? I just didn't want to go on." "But how could I leave you there?" his friend replied. "You were my best friend." The exhausted friend turned, saying, "You stopped when I was down 3 times. You stopped and forced me to get up, yelling and screaming at me 3 times. Get up. Why? Why did you do that?" By this time, they, as well as Judy and Maribel, were all crying as this wonderful friend responded, "Buddy, I could not let you die. You are my best friend." So these are the kind of gifts given, witnessed, and received here at the border. Thanks.
Thank you, Sister Lucy. That was inspiring and powerful. Eric, can we get all the panelists up, please? There we go. So we have some Q&A questions. Jamie, are you on?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Can we put Jamie on too, please, Eric? So why don't I just start with the first question that was up there. It's from Allison to Blake. Are there any bills in Congress that would ensure the recognition of indigenous populations as separate nations in US law? Who are the Congress people who are working on this?
Yeah, I want to show you one last thing, which I didn't in the presentation, which actually answers the question. The answer is no. The question is perhaps why. Can everybody see that last slide on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so when things are reported by border organizations, we are the only possible advocates to the US government about the fact of the kinds of people who are arriving here. And when people are not counted, then it appears that they don't exist. I'm a little afraid you can't see the bottom of the slide. Is that true?
There's a black bar. That's gone. We're good. Oh, there's back again.
Yeah, it's the control. I don't know how to get rid of it, and that's problematic. Anyway, the point at the end of this was, of the 8,000 accounts, we went through and searched for any word having to do with trans, lesbian, gay, LGBTQ, both in English and in Spanish, even pejorative terms. So out of all of those narratives, of which I showed you an example, we found 31 out of 8,000 accounts of people who were identified, gender identified, as coming from a vulnerable group. Obviously, women were also targeted, but there is no way, there's not enough time to actually count them all. Indigenous, however, out of the 8,000 accounts, only 3 were identified as indigenous. So if we look at what this means statistically, and this is how the government will deal with this, our count from Elitas and American Immigrants for Justice out of Dade County know that 20% during the time period in which Central Americans were allowed in and Mexicans, 20% were indigenous. And if we took the 8,000 and we multiplied that times 20%, you're going to get 1,255, not 3. And the math for the gendered account for the other result here is just below this. I'm sorry, I don't know how to get rid of this black bar, but it's there. And I would say a proxy for LGBTQ, though not a good one, would be 10% of population in most countries. Probably it's higher than that because LGBTQ oftentimes are fleeing their countries because their countries don't recognize their legal rights as LGBTQ people. But even at 10%, of course, the number would be staggeringly higher than 31. So why does this matter? It matters because unless the border organizations raise their voices and we identify those people who are coming through here, they forever don't exist. Indigenous organizations were involved in the White House Task Force on Reunification, which is the Biden answer to the illegal practice of the Trump administration of the forced separation of families. In the process, in the Biden administration, they asked and they got from those who were directly involved to sign non-disclosure agreements. Isabel, you will appreciate this. And that meant that they couldn't disclose anything publicly that was going on. That included the ACLU and several other organizations. There were demands made by the indigenous groups who were not let in originally, but pushed our way in. And we said we wanted an accounting for the separation of families who are indigenous. That demand has been denied. So the Trump administration not only created the crime of the forced separation of families, which is a crime under international statutes that we are a signatory to the US, but the Biden administration has covered it up, legally covered it up. They won't be prosecuting anybody. They won't even have the statistics out there. So why does this matter? And why is there no legislation? Because the Congress is not convinced that it's a problem.
Thank you, Blake, for that bleak assessment. Before I read the next question from Vicky, if you on the panel have questions or comments to make, please, after this next question, lay them on us. And perhaps you have questions of each other. So the other question we have is from Vicky. It's for Gail. How can we buy an embroidered bag or bracelet, etc.? Gail, are you with us?
Yeah, I am. You could get in touch with Celevision through our website, and we could show you pictures. We're in the process of trying to find places where we could sell them. Right now, we're sort of selling them out of the back of our car when we get them from Casa de la Esperanza. Right now, they're making a number of them to take to Washington, D.C. Dora is going to be back there during the Poor People's Walk and going to be meeting with people in DC. So she's taking some for gifts. But we do have some. You could also you could send me a text message. I don't mind if people do that. If they want to share my contact information, I could put it in chat if you want. You can
That
send
would
me a
be
text.
great, Gail, if you
Okay.
could put all of that into the chat so
Okay.
people
And
could get a
Tom-
hold of you. Yes.
Tom, I can also add that everybody who's a participant will receive an email with everyone else's contact info. I will send an email out beforehand to make sure you're okay with that. So if you opt out of that, we won't include it, but that everybody will have each other so you can follow up with folks later.
Thanks, Kat. So, Jamie.
There were a couple questions. One was in the chat and one I had answered in the Q&A, and they came during Gail's presentation, so I wanted to voice them here. One was to explain, or a question about what a life straw is. I think that's what they're called. And I had answered that, but if Gail wanted to, or anyone wanted to speak to that. And then the other question that came from Isabel was if, and I think this was kind of towards Gail and that neck of the woods, if there's anything, there's apparently an anti-immigration protest event that might be coming on July 4th. And if folks in and around Sasabe are preparing for that, if I have the geography right.
Yes, you do. I could answer both of those. The life straw is, I don't know if you could see me. I have the,
You don't have your video on.
there you go. The life
There you go.
straw is good for 1,000 gallons. Can you hear me?
Yes.
These are good for 1,000 gallons. You take both ends off, you put it in the water, basically you drink out of it. They do save lives, 1,000 gallons. You can buy these, like at REI, they cost about $20. We get better deals because Mark Sanders is able to get them in bulk. So they are lifesavers to give to people out there.
Because we have lost
they're great.
people who were crossing from drinking the cattle tank water or others that made them sick enough to die.
Yes. It doesn't matter how awful it looks. It's not going to improve the taste, but it does make it safer to drink. The other question was about the problem at the border. We have had issues. At first, it was with the BOP, the Vets on Patrol, with Louis Mayer, and he has sort of gone underground because there's warrants out for his arrest. And QAnon has come in and taken that place. I had an incident with them on the end of April where they chased me. They accused me of having a quote unquote illegal alien in my car, which was a young man from Guatemala who'd been in this country 30 years, and he had all of his proper ID with him. But it was a pretty bad experience, and all of my information ended all over the internet. And it's a little frightening. I've got the Southern Poverty Law Center working on it, as well as Margot Cowan and some other people. They have advertised that they're going to have an event called Wallapalooza, and it's supposed to start on the 1st of July and go for the 4th. See if they can handle the heat down there. So far, we've been difficulty finding who will take legal responsibility for that area, because it's in a place that they call the Roosevelt Reservation. And even though nobody pays attention to that anymore, it seems like they're using that as an excuse to say, oh, I don't have jurisdiction there. So we have no idea how many people they're expecting, but they have on their advertisement to bring beer and guns. And so they're not pleasant people. And I'll have my number in chat. Feel free to get in touch with me and I could give you more information. Thanks.
As Margot was telling us at one of the organizing committee meetings a week or two ago that these are the folks, the QAnon folks, who are camping in the desert and capturing kids that are coming across unaccompanied and abusing them giving them candy and taking their information of who they were headed to in the interior, and then sending armed nasty people to their doors, and who would demand various things from. So basically harassment of an extreme sort. And these are the folks that followed you in the desert, bumping your bumper and
Chased me.
chased you. These people are armed, and they're dangerous people.
And there's an
So-
article about it in the New York Times too, if anybody.
Right,
is
right.
interested. And I just put the
So,
information.
right.
Okay.
Thank you, Gail.
Done. Uh-huh.
Other comments in the couple minutes we have left? Sister Lucy, you had something else for us, didn't you?
I can share a video with you that we found. And it says a little bit more about our planting the crosses in the desert.
We all yearn for comfort. It's got to be one of the greatest pains to be alone and know that you're dying.
And so when they're gone, they'll say, I wonder whatever happened. I'm surprised that he never called, never wrote, because they don't know that he dropped in the desert.
We place or plant crosses in the desert where remains have been found in order to honor the memory of that person's life, their story, their desire, their dream for a better life.
I like to bring Catholicism and my experience in Native American circles. And I like to extend an invitation to everybody that's here, the spirits that are here. We put our prayers down into the fire, and then that incense burns and smoke goes up to our Creator carrying our prayers. And actually the Holy Spirit is in the fire of the charcoals that are burning.
It's important for everybody just to be there in this place that has a connection to a life that was lost tragically, and somehow their memory or their story is in the earth there.
We were very fortunate today that it had the name of the person that fell. It has the date that they think he passed. When you have a cross and the crossbar has no identificado, not identified, that really breaks my heart to see that.
Not always do these men and women know what they risk when they start crossing the desert. It had to be their love for their family, their concern for trying to raise their children. I think we are connecting them to that story.
So we want to be sure that our prayers reach the family and that they accept what has happened and understand that their son or daughter is not forgotten.
Remembering these people who we never knew, I think, is a ministry that gives witness to the fact that we are all one people and in the spirit of trying to become one world. I have to believe that our prayer and that our action, our witness, adds something.
It's not just about politics. It's about being human and treating people with dignity.
Jesus said, welcome the stranger. So it's a very biblical and Christian and human thing to remember people, not a political thing. I like to think of planting more than a cross because it is going to grow something after this. This something in the desert can live on to memorialize a life and a story and a dream. This person's life lost in the desert is a seed for some kind of hope.
Thank you, Sister Lucy. Thank you, Blake. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Gail. Adelante.
Sorry.
You know, there's a quote that Ingrid Encalada Torre who was in sanctuary in Colorado for almost 5 years in various churches, including the Friends meeting that I belong to in Denver. It's one of her favorite sayings, and it goes, caminante no hay camino, se hace camino al andar. Traveler or pilgrim, there is no road. We make the road as we go.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to all of our panelists here. We are going to be taking a lunch break. It is about 12:15 Pacific time right now, and we'll be coming back at 1 o'clock Arizona/Pacific time, and we'll have some music playing, and we'll have some images, photos of past migrant trails that will be on the screen if you would like to watch that while you eat some food or take a break. So we'll see you back here in about 45 minutes. Thanks, everybody.
Hasta pronto. Gracias.